I've been keeping a notebook these past few weeks, writing down everything I can remember about the schedules I used to build, all the properties I coordinated, all the careful timetables I created. It's probably pointless. Who would I even show it to? But it gives me something to do in this travelodge outside Swindon, where I've been hiding for nearly a fortnight. The notebook sits on the bedside table next to a half-eaten meal deal from the petrol station. And sometimes I just stare at it, wondering if writing it all down makes me feel better or worse about what I did. I used to work as a scheduler for a logistics company, the sort of job where you coordinate deliveries and manage timetables to keep everything running smoothly. Then the company collapsed, and I needed to find something else quickly. That's how I ended up doing scheduling work for people I never met. Coordinating activities I told myself were none of my business, building timetables for things I've only just realized were criminal. The heating in this room cuts out every few hours, and I lie here in the cold, wondering if they're looking for me, if they've worked out that I finally understand what all those careful schedules were actually coordinating. I'd been working as a logistics scheduler for nearly 15 years when the company collapsed. One of those situations where you think everything's fine until suddenly it isn't, and you're told on a Friday afternoon that the company's in administration and your job's gone effective immediately. I was 48 years old with very specific skills that turned out not to be particularly transferable. Scheduling work is more complicated than people realize. You're not just putting together timetables, you're coordinating multiple resources, anticipating conflicts, building in contingencies for when things go wrong. It requires a particular type of mind, the ability to see patterns and predict bottlenecks before they happen. I'd always been good at it, took pride in keeping everything running smoothly, even when circumstances were difficult. After the redundancy, I spent about 3 months applying for similar positions at other logistics companies. But the industry was contracting, and most places were automating the work I used to do. The few jobs I found wanted younger people with different qualifications, technical skills I'd never needed in my previous role. That's when I found the posting on a job board for remote workers. Someone needed an experienced scheduler to coordinate activities for what they described as a service coordination company. The pay was generous, nearly £4,000 per month for what they estimated would be about 30 hours of work per week. They emphasized that they needed someone who could manage complex schedules involving multiple participants, someone who was detail-oriented and could work independently. The job description could have been written specifically for my skill set. I applied immediately, had a phone interview 2 days later with someone who called himself Mr. Peterson, and was offered the position by the end of that week. Mr. Peterson explained that they coordinated various service providers across different regions, and they needed someone who could schedule activities efficiently to avoid conflicts and maximize resource utilization. It all sounded perfectly reasonable. I'd be working remotely using their scheduling software, receiving requests from various service coordinators, and building timetables that ensured everything ran smoothly. The confidentiality requirements were strict. I'd need to maintain absolute discretion about the schedules I created and never discuss the work with anyone outside the company. But that seemed normal enough for a commercial operation that probably dealt with competitive information. The first few assignments were straightforward. I'd receive requests to schedule activities in specific locations at particular times, and I'd coordinate multiple participants to ensure they could complete their work without conflicting with each other. The schedules typically involved 2 or 3 people working at the same location in sequence, each with specific time windows they needed to operate within. I built the schedules carefully, accounting for travel times between locations, potential delays, even weather conditions that might affect timing. It was exactly the sort of work I'd been doing for years, just for a different type of operation. I didn't ask what specific services the participants were providing. That wasn't my concern. My job was simply to ensure the schedules worked efficiently. Mr. Peterson was pleased with my work, and the schedules started coming more frequently. I was coordinating activities across multiple cities, managing dozens of participants, building complex timetables that ensured everyone could complete their assignments without interfering with each other. The work was satisfying, in the way good scheduling always is. Seeing all the pieces fit together perfectly, knowing you've anticipated every potential conflict. But I started noticing aspects of the schedules that seemed unusual. Many activities were scheduled for early morning hours, between roughly 5 and 7 when most people would still be asleep. Others were timed to coincide with specific events, school run times, typical working hours, even what appeared to be coordination with public transport schedules. When I questioned why so many activities needed to occur during these specific windows, Mr. Peterson explained that their service providers needed to work when client properties would be empty, or when clients would be distracted with other obligations. The scheduling precision was essential to ensure services could be delivered efficiently without disturbing clients unnecessarily. That explanation made a certain amount of sense, though I was troubled by the secrecy around what services were actually being provided. But Mr. Peterson emphasized that confidentiality was essential to their business model, and schedulers who asked too many questions about service details wouldn't last long in the position. I accepted that boundary because I needed the income and enjoyed the work itself. The schedules were intellectually satisfying, complex puzzles that required careful coordination of multiple moving parts. I told myself the specific nature of the services being provided wasn't my concern. I was just ensuring the logistics worked properly. The assignments became more detailed over time. Instead of simple location and timing information, I was receiving comprehensive briefings about specific properties and their occupants. I'd be told that a particular house would be empty between 8 and 6 on weekdays, that another property had vulnerable security on the rear entrance, that a third location had no immediate neighbors who might observe activity. I was building schedules that incorporated this detailed intelligence about specific properties, coordinating participants to take advantage of particular vulnerabilities at precise times. The work still felt like logistics coordination, but I was becoming increasingly aware that the services being scheduled weren't conventional commercial activities. The breakthrough came when I recognized an address in one of the schedules I was building. It was my sister's house in Gloucester, a property I'd visited dozens of times over the years. The schedule requested 3 participants at sequential times during a weekday morning when I knew my sister would be at work and her husband would be visiting their mother in hospital. I realized immediately that I was scheduling a burglary of my own sister's home. The detailed intelligence about when the property would be empty, the notes about security vulnerabilities, the coordination of multiple participants to ensure efficient completion. It was all designed to facilitate theft from someone I loved. I thought about all the other schedules I'd built over the past few months, all the detailed property intelligence I'd been coordinating. Every schedule I'd created had probably enabled burglaries of homes whose occupants had no idea their routines had been documented and their vulnerabilities assessed. But what made it unbearable was understanding that my scheduling skills had made these crimes more efficient and less risky for the criminals involved. By carefully coordinating multiple participants and accounting for every potential conflict or complication, I'd helped professionalize burglary into a systematic enterprise that maximized success while minimizing detection. I tried to refuse the schedule involving my sister's house, but Mr. Peterson made it clear that wasn't an option. I'd been building schedules for months, had access to detailed intelligence about hundreds of properties, knew exactly how the coordination system worked. Walking away would mean explaining where I'd been working and what I'd been doing, and it would mean giving up income I'd become dependent on. I was trapped by my own complicity and my professional effectiveness. The better I'd been at scheduling, the more valuable I'd become to an operation that was systematically targeting homes across the country. And now my own sister's property was on the list because I'd been too focused on doing good logistics work to question what I was coordinating. I tried warning my sister about the planned burglary without revealing how I knew about it, suggesting she should install better security and vary her routine. But I couldn't explain the specifics without admitting my role in scheduling the crime against her home. She thanked me for the concern, but didn't seem to take it seriously enough to actually change her habits. That's when I started documenting all the schedules I'd created, keeping detailed records of the properties I'd coordinated activity for and the participants I'd scheduled. I told myself I was preserving evidence for eventual reporting to authorities, but really, I was just trying to feel less guilty about the crimes I'd enabled. The schedules I'd built weren't just enabling individual burglaries. They were part of a coordinated operation that targeted hundreds of properties across multiple regions. I found myself accessing parts of the scheduling system I wasn't supposed to see, discovering the full scope of what I'd been participating in. The operation maintained comprehensive intelligence about vulnerable properties organized by region, occupant type, and potential value. My schedules were being used to coordinate systematic targeting that ensured maximum efficiency and minimal risk. Multiple teams would work different regions simultaneously, all following schedules I'd carefully built to avoid conflicts and complications. Some schedules focused on elderly people living alone, coordinating burglaries during the specific hours when they'd be at medical appointments or visiting friends. Others targeted families during school holidays when homes would be empty for extended periods. A few concentrated on small businesses during weekends when nobody would be on the premises. I was looking at evidence that my scheduling work had enabled hundreds of burglaries across England and Wales. Every careful coordination I'd created, every contingency I'd planned for, every efficiency I'd built into the schedules, it had all made these crimes more successful and harder to prevent. But what disturbed me most was discovering how the operation used my schedules to refine their targeting. They tracked success rates for different types of properties and adjusted their intelligence gathering based on which of my schedules had been most effective. My professional expertise was being used to optimize criminal activity, making each wave of burglaries more efficient than the last. One analysis document discussed how my careful timing had reduced police response effectiveness by ensuring crimes occurred during periods when patrols were focused elsewhere. Another praised my contingency planning for minimizing the impact of unexpected complications. They were treating my scheduling work as the professional foundation that made their entire operation viable. I found schedules I'd built that had been used to target my own neighborhood in Bristol. Properties I'd walked past regularly. Homes belonging to people I knew casually from local shops and parks. All of them had been burgled during precisely the time windows I'd scheduled, with participants coordinated according to the careful timetables I'd created. One schedule had targeted the elderly couple who lived 3 doors down from me, coordinating a burglary during the 2-hour window when they attended their weekly medical appointments. Another had focused on the single mother across the street, scheduling activity for the precise time when she'd be collecting her children from school and stopping at the supermarket. These weren't random crimes. They were systematically planned operations that relied on detailed intelligence and professional scheduling. and I'd provided that professional scheduling, making it all possible through my careful coordination and logistics expertise. I tried contacting the police about what I'd discovered, but explaining my role without admitting extensive complicity proved impossible. I'd been building burglary schedules for months. Accepting substantial payment for work I should have recognized wasn't legitimate. The schedules I'd created had enabled hundreds of crimes against real people. The officer I spoke to was professional but frank. I'd knowingly coordinated criminal activity, even if I'd tried to avoid understanding what I was scheduling. The detailed documentation I'd kept actually demonstrated my intimate involvement in planning systematic burglaries. Cooperation might reduce potential charges, but I shouldn't expect immunity from prosecution for my role in the operation. I was advised to stop scheduling work immediately and refuse further contact with Mr. Peterson. But he'd already anticipated that possibility. I started receiving messages reminding me of the comprehensive records they had of my scheduling work, documentation that showed my professional involvement in coordinating hundreds of burglaries. The messages emphasized that schedulers who cause problems would face both legal consequences and more immediate difficulties. They had my address, knew my routines, had detailed intelligence about my vulnerabilities, all the same type of information I'd been using to build schedules for burglaries of other people's homes. Then I found my own property listed in their intelligence database. Someone had documented my daily routine, identified when my flat would be empty, assessed security vulnerabilities I'd never considered. They were preparing to target me using the same systematic approach I'd been scheduling for hundreds of other victims. But the schedule that appeared for my property was different from the ones I'd been building for burglaries. Instead of coordinating participants to steal possessions, it scheduled people to ensure I understood the consequences of causing problems for their operation. The activities were vague but clearly threatening, designed to make me too frightened to report what I'd discovered. That's when I left Bristol entirely, abandoning my flat and most of my possessions to hide in hotels across the southwest. I've been moving every few days, never staying long enough to establish a routine that could be documented and scheduled against me. But I know my sister's house was eventually targeted. She called me about a month after I'd left Bristol to say they'd been burgled during exactly the time window I'd tried to warn her about. The thieves had known precisely when the house would be empty, had targeted specific valuables, had left minimal evidence. It was executed perfectly according to the schedule I'd built, but refused to finalize. I couldn't tell her I'd scheduled that burglary myself, that I'd coordinated the participants and built the timetable that made it possible. Couldn't explain that my professional scheduling skills had been weaponized against her home. All I could do was offer sympathy and guilt. The schedules I built are still being used. Other schedulers have probably been recruited to replace me. People will make the same rationalizations I did about just doing logistics work without responsibility for what's being coordinated. The operation is probably still expanding, still targeting hundreds of properties using the systematic approach I helped establish. I keep thinking about my sister, about the elderly couple 3 doors down, about all the other people whose homes were burgled according to schedules I'd carefully built to maximize efficiency and minimize complications. They'd gone about their normal lives never knowing that someone had documented their routines and built professional timetables for criminal activity against their homes. The schedules taught me that professional skills become weapons when applied to criminal purposes, that logistics expertise can enable systematic harm regardless of your intentions or understanding, that every efficiency I built in, every contingency I planned for, every conflict I prevented, it all made the crimes I was coordinating more successful and harder to stop. and that once you've spent months building schedules you know are enabling criminal activity, you become too compromised to report it without facing severe consequences yourself. The evidence of your professional involvement is permanent, documented in schedules that show your expertise was essential to the operation's success. I suppose that's why I'm sitting in this travelodge watching the car park rather than helping police dismantle the operation I was part of. Because I know the schedules I kept as evidence implicate me as thoroughly as they expose the operation, and I'm not brave enough to face consequences for choices I made when I convinced myself I was just doing logistics work. All I can do is hope that someone else will eventually expose these operations, that other schedulers will find courage I lack to report what they're coordinating despite the personal cost, and hope that people whose homes I scheduled for burglary manage to recover from losses I helped enable. Because the operation is still running, still recruiting schedulers, still using professional logistics coordination to target hundreds of homes. And I helped prove that scheduling expertise makes burglary more efficient, helped establish standards that turn theft into a systematic enterprise, helped create an industry that treats people's homes as targets to be coordinated and optimized. The worst part is knowing I can't undo any of it. Can't warn people whose homes are scheduled for targeting. Can't prevent burglaries coordinated according to timetables built using techniques I established. All I can do is hide in cheap hotels and wonder if they'll eventually decide I'm enough of a liability to be worth the trouble of scheduling something permanent against me. I just wish I'd asked more questions at the beginning. Wish I'd recognized sooner what kind of services I was scheduling. Wish I'd been brave enough to walk away when I first started suspecting the truth. But I didn't. And now I live with the consequences of choices I made when professional satisfaction and financial need mattered more than questioning what my skills were really being used for. This may seem like a strange way to start a story, but here goes. Up until very recently, I used to exercise religiously. I'd always use one of those fitness apps that logs your runs and walks, maps your routes, counts your steps, tells you how many calories you burned. It felt good to see the progress, to have concrete data about getting healthier. I used it for nearly a year before I discovered that every route I'd ever taken, every location I'd ever stopped at, every pattern in my daily movement had been compiled into a profile that was being sold to people who had very specific reasons for wanting to know exactly where I'd be and when. People who'd purchased that information multiple times, who'd used it in ways I'm still discovering, who know more about my life than most of my actual friends do. I'm a speech therapist working with children at several primary schools across Derby. It's the kind of job that involves a lot of moving around during the day, visiting different schools, working with kids individually or in small groups. I'm generally active anyway, enjoy keeping fit, try to walk whenever I can, rather than driving everywhere. Using a fitness app seemed like a natural way to track that activity and motivate myself to stay healthy. The app I downloaded was called Health Path. It had decent reviews, a clean interface, seemed straightforward enough. Free basic version, with optional premium features you could pay for, the standard business model for fitness apps. I started using it last January, logging my morning runs around the neighborhood, my walks between schools during the workday, my evening strolls when the weather was nice. The app was quite engaging. It would send encouraging notifications when you hit milestones, suggest routes based on what you'd done before, create statistics showing your progress over time. It had social features too, where you could add friends and see each other's activities, though I never really used that aspect. I just wanted the personal tracking, the satisfaction of seeing my activity logged and quantified. Over the months, I got into a comfortable routine with it. Morning run before work, usually the same 3 or 4 routes through my neighborhood, depending on how much time I had. Walks during the day between school visits. Routes that became predictable as I figured out the quickest paths. Evening walks most days after dinner. Circular routes around the local park or along the canal towpath. The app faithfully recorded all of it, building up a comprehensive picture of my movement patterns. I particularly liked the feature that showed your most frequented locations. It would identify places you visited regularly and give them labels: home, work, gym, that sort of thing. Mine showed my house, the various schools I worked at, a coffee shop I'd stop at most mornings between appointments, the park where I'd do my evening walks. It was oddly satisfying seeing my regular life mapped out like that. Proof that I had a routine and structure to my days. Around 6 months into using the app, I started noticing a car that seemed to appear in the same locations I did. A silver Audi that I'd see parked near my house in the mornings. Then later parked near one of the schools I worked at. Then sometimes near the coffee shop or the park. I thought it was coincidence at first. Someone who happened to have a similar routine to mine, living and working in the same areas. But the timing of the appearances was too consistent. The car would be parked on my street when I left for my morning run, usually a few houses down, and I'd see it pull away shortly after I started running. Then it would be at one of my school locations later that same day, parked with a clear view of the entrance. It started to feel less like coincidence and more like someone was deliberately being in the same place as I was, following a schedule that matched mine too closely to be random. I tried to see who was driving it, but the windows were tinted enough that I could never get a clear view. I never saw anyone get in or out. It was just there, consistently present in locations where I spent time, watching without ever doing anything overtly threatening or illegal. I reported it to the police after about 2 weeks of noticing this pattern. They took a statement, but explained that someone parking legally on public streets wasn't something they could act on unless there was evidence of actual harassment or threats. They took the registration number and said they'd look into it, but they were honest about not being able to do much without clear evidence of criminal intent. The car stopped appearing after I filed that police report, which should have been reassuring, but actually made me more uneasy. It suggested someone had known I'd contacted police, that they were aware of my concerns and had adjusted their behavior accordingly. That implied they were paying very close attention to me, close enough to know when I'd taken action against them. Then I started receiving anonymous messages through various platforms. They'd come through email, through social media accounts I barely used, even through a professional networking site I'd signed up for years ago and forgotten about. The messages were brief and cryptic, usually just mentioning a specific location and time. The coffee shop at 8:15 on Tuesday. The canal path at 6:30 on Friday. The park bench near the playground at 7 on Sunday evening. What made them disturbing was how accurate they were. These were exact descriptions of where I'd been and when, locations and times that weren't public knowledge, that I hadn't shared with anyone. Someone was tracking my movements with precision and letting me know they were doing it, sending these messages as proof that my routine was completely transparent to them. I became hypervigilant about my surroundings, constantly checking if anyone was following me, varying my routes to avoid predictability. But the messages continued, adapting to my new patterns, demonstrating that whoever was sending them could track me regardless of what precautions I took. If I took a different route to work, I'd receive a message mentioning that new route. If I stopped going to my usual coffee shop and tried a different one, a message would reference the new location. A colleague at work suggested that maybe someone had access to my phone's location data. That seemed impossible. I was careful about app permissions, didn't share my location publicly, had privacy settings enabled. But she convinced me to check what apps had location access, and that's when I discovered HealthPath was tracking my location continuously, not just when I was actively using it for exercise logging. The app's permissions showed it had access to my location at all times, even when it was running in the background. I'd granted that permission when I first installed it, clicking through the setup screens without reading carefully, assuming it needed location access for mapping runs, but not realizing it meant constant tracking regardless of whether I was exercising. I immediately revoked the location permission and looked more carefully at what data the app had collected. The history section showed every single location I'd visited over the past 6 months, with timestamps accurate to the minute. Every school I'd worked at, every shop I'd visited, every route I'd walked. It was a comprehensive surveillance record of my life, all stored in an app I'd voluntarily installed because I wanted to track my fitness. But the data wasn't just stored locally on my phone. The app's privacy policy, which I read properly for the first time, explained that location data was uploaded to their servers for service improvement and shared with third-party partners for various purposes, including advertising and analytics. The language was vague enough that it could mean almost anything, and I had no way of knowing who these third-party partners were or what they were doing with my location history. I deleted the app immediately and contacted HealthPath's customer support, asking them to delete all my data from their servers. They responded with an automated message saying data deletion requests would be processed within 30 days, which did nothing to address my immediate concerns about who currently had access to 6 months of detailed location tracking. The anonymous messages stopped after I deleted the app, which confirmed my suspicions that whoever was tracking me had been using data from HealthPath. But that confirmation made everything worse in a way, because it meant my location information had been accessible to someone with malicious intent, someone who'd used fitness tracking data to stalk me systematically over an extended period. A few weeks later, a police detective contacted me. They'd been investigating HealthPath as part of a broader inquiry into location data being sold illegally on the dark web. My name had come up because I'd filed that initial report about being followed, and they'd found evidence that my location data specifically had been sold multiple times through a marketplace that specialized in personal tracking information. The detective explained how it worked. HealthPath had been collecting detailed location data from thousands of users, far more information than necessary for fitness tracking. That data was being packaged into individual user profiles and sold to anyone willing to pay for access. The profiles included complete location histories, regular routines, frequently visited places, predictable patterns that could be used for various purposes including stalking, burglary planning, or targeted harassment. She showed me, with obvious discomfort, the listing that had included my data. It was on a dark web marketplace organized like a commercial database, with search functions allowing buyers to filter by location, age, gender, activity patterns, and other criteria. My profile was listed under active single females in the Derby area with predictable daily routines. The listing included sample data showing the kind of information buyers would receive, screenshots of my most visited locations, examples of my regular routes with timestamps, analysis of my typical schedule showing when I was reliably at home versus when I was away. It was marketed as comprehensive surveillance intelligence, useful for anyone who wanted to monitor someone's movements without their knowledge. The purchase history showed my profile had been bought by 5 different accounts, 5 separate people had paid money for detailed information about my daily movements, my routine, my predictable patterns. The marketplace didn't reveal buyer identities, but the detective explained they were working to trace transactions and identify who'd purchased access to my data and others like it. What made it worse was discovering that HealthPath had known about the data sales. The company wasn't directly selling to the marketplace. That was being done by someone who'd gained unauthorized access to their databases. But HealthPath had been aware of the security breach for months before taking action to stop it, or warn users that their location data had been compromised. They'd prioritized avoiding bad publicity over protecting users from potential stalking and harassment. The investigation revealed that tens of thousands of HealthPath users had their location data stolen and sold. The marketplace had been operating for over a year before law enforcement discovered it, during which time countless individuals had been tracked without their knowledge by people who'd purchased their movement patterns and routines. The detective walked me through what they knew about the 5 accounts that had purchased my profile. 2 had been traced to individuals arrested for stalking offenses against other victims. 1 belonged to someone with a history of burglary, who'd apparently been using location data to identify when targets would be away from home. The other 2 remained unidentified, their purchases made through anonymous accounts that couldn't be traced to real identities. Knowing that at least 2 unidentified people still possessed detailed information about my movements, that they'd paid money for access to my location history and could still be monitoring me somehow, was terrifying in a way that's hard to articulate. The silver Audi had probably been one of the 5 buyers, using my real-time location data to show up wherever I was. But I'd never know which buyer it was, or whether the others were still out there, still interested in my routine, still watching for opportunities I couldn't anticipate. The legal consequences for HealthPath were substantial, but felt inadequate. They received fines and were forced to implement better security measures. But that didn't undo the year of data collection they'd allowed to be stolen and sold. The company eventually shut down entirely, unable to survive the reputational damage and legal costs. But by then, the harm was irreversible. I had to change significant aspects of my life to feel even marginally safe. I moved house within 3 months of discovering the data breach, unable to stay somewhere whose location had been sold to strangers. I changed my work schedule and routes as much as possible, varying my patterns obsessively to avoid being predictable. I stopped using any fitness tracking apps or services, stopped sharing location data with any apps regardless of their purpose. But I know the historical data still exists somewhere. 6 months of detailed location tracking, showing everywhere I went and when, preserved in private collections of people who downloaded it before the marketplace was shut down. That information is outdated now, showing addresses I no longer visit and routines I've deliberately abandoned, but it still reveals patterns about my behavior and preferences that could be useful to someone interested in finding me. The psychological impact has been harder to manage than the practical security measures. I'm constantly aware of my surroundings now, checking for cars that seem to follow me, watching for people who appear in multiple locations, unable to relax in public spaces. The paranoia affects my work. I'm distracted during therapy sessions, anxious between appointments, hypervigilant in ways that make it difficult to maintain the calm, professional presence my job requires. I think about those 5 buyers constantly. Who were they? Why were they interested in my movement specifically? What did they plan to do with the information they purchased? 2 have been identified and arrested, but what about the other 3? Are they still monitoring me somehow, still interested in my location, still looking for opportunities to exploit the patterns they learned from data I never meant to share? The detective mentioned that location data from fitness apps had become increasingly valuable on dark web marketplaces. People use fitness tracking innocently, wanting to monitor their health and activity, never realizing they're creating comprehensive surveillance records that can be stolen and sold. The data shows not just where someone goes, but their regular patterns, their predictable routines, their vulnerable moments when they're alone or away from home. She also explained that the 5 purchases of my profile had occurred over several months, suggesting ongoing interest rather than one-time curiosity. Someone had bought my data, monitored me for a while, and the information had been valuable enough that others subsequently purchased it too. I was a product with repeat customers, my movements and routine deemed worth paying for multiple times by different people, whose intentions I'll never fully understand. I gave that app permission to track my location because I wanted to monitor my fitness. I clicked through setup screens without reading carefully, granted access without understanding the implications, used it faithfully for 6 months while it compiled comprehensive intelligence about every aspect of my daily life. That data was stolen and sold to people who used it to follow me, to learn my routine, to know where I'd be, and when, with accuracy, I couldn't have achieved myself. That's what I think about now when I see people using fitness tracking apps, logging their runs and walks, sharing their routes and achievements. Most of them probably have no idea what data they're generating or who might have access to it. They're focused on their health goals, their activity statistics, their personal progress, never imagining that the same information could be weaponized by someone who views their location history as valuable intelligence worth purchasing. The app promised to help me get healthier. Instead, it made me a target for stalkers and criminals who paid money for detailed information about my movements. It created a surveillance record more comprehensive than I could imagine, accessible to people I never met and couldn't protect myself from. And somewhere online, that record still exists. My 6 months of location data preserved in collections I'll never find, potentially being shared through networks I'll never access. I track my exercise differently now. Paper notebook, handwritten notes that never leave my house. No apps, no GPS, no digital records that could be stolen or sold. It's primitive and probably seems paranoid to people who use fitness tracking without incident. But I know what happened when I trusted an app with my location data. I know the marketplace where that data was sold, the buyers who purchased it, the year of surveillance that resulted from wanting to count my steps and map my runs. The data exists. The violation is permanent. And somewhere, someone probably still has my old location history. 6 months of my life mapped out in detail, showing everywhere I went and when I went there. That information is outdated now, but it's still mine, still private, still something I never consented to share with strangers who paid for access to my movements. And that knowledge will stay with me, a constant reminder that the tools we use for self-improvement can be turned against us in ways we never anticipate until it's far too late to protect ourselves. I barely slept in the past 2 weeks. Every little sound makes me jump now. The refrigerator humming, a car door closing outside, the heating system clicking on. I keep thinking I hear things that aren't there, voices hidden in everyday noises. The more I keep this bottled up, the more I feel like I'm going to lose my mind completely, so here goes. I work as an audio engineer at a small recording studio in Bristol. Nothing fancy or high profile, mostly local bands and podcast production. But I've always had a good ear for sound. That's what makes this whole thing so much worse. I should have noticed it sooner. I should have recognized what I was hearing the first time. About 3 weeks ago, my friend Alex sent me a message asking if I could give some feedback on a music track he was working on. We've known each other since university, where we both studied sound engineering, but while I went into studio work, he took a more experimental route with electronic music. He's always sending me works in progress, asking for my opinion on mixing or mastering, and I'm usually happy to help. It's a good arrangement. I keep my critical listening skills sharp, and he gets free professional feedback. The track he sent me that night was different from his usual style. He described it as ambient experimental, with some field recordings mixed in. He said he'd been playing around with layering environmental sounds to create atmosphere beneath the music. That didn't seem unusual to me. Field recordings are common in certain genres, and Alex was always trying new techniques. I remember it was a Tuesday night, around 11 p.m. I just finished a late session at the studio and was unwinding at my desk at home with a glass of whiskey, still wearing the clothes I'd worked in all day. My flat was quiet, except for the occasional car passing on the wet street outside. It had been raining all day, one of those endless grey February days that make you feel like summer might never come again. I put on my studio headphones, the expensive ones I use for detailed listening, and downloaded Alex's track. It was about 8 minutes long, which seemed a bit excessive for a demo, but that was typical of Alex. He's never been one for radio-friendly 3-minute songs. The track started with a low drone, gradually building with subtle electronic elements. Nothing unusual there. Around the 2-minute mark, the field recordings began to blend in. What sounded like distant traffic, wind through trees, maybe the ambient noise of a public space. It was actually quite effective, creating this sense of physical space within the music. But around 4 minutes in, something caught my attention. Behind the main elements, almost completely buried in the mix, I could hear what sounded like voices. This isn't uncommon in field recordings. You often pick up snippets of conversation when recording in public places, but something about these voices made me uneasy. They sounded tense, maybe frightened. I adjusted the equalization on my computer, boosting the mid-range frequencies where human voices typically sit, and played that section again. With the adjustment, I could make out more clearly what sounded like a person, possibly a woman, speaking urgently. The words weren't clear, but the tone definitely conveyed distress. I paused the track, feeling suddenly uncomfortable. I told myself it was just an interesting sample Alex had found online or recorded from a film. Field recordings often have strange, ambiguous sounds that your brain tries to interpret as something recognizable. Audio engineers call it pareidolia, like seeing faces in clouds, but with sound. Your brain tries to find patterns, meaning, where there might be none. I continued listening, but now I was focused entirely on the background elements. As the track progressed, the voices became slightly more prominent. Around the 6-minute mark, buried under a swelling synth pad, I distinctly heard what sounded like someone screaming. It was distant, heavily processed with reverb, but unmistakable once I'd noticed it. And it didn't sound like it was from a film or staged. It had a raw, desperate quality that made my skin crawl. I stopped the track again and took off my headphones, suddenly aware of how fast my heart was beating. The silence of my flat felt oppressive now. I took a large sip of whiskey, trying to calm myself down. I was being ridiculous. Alex was just experimenting with unsettling samples to create atmosphere. That's all it was. I put my headphones back on, determined to finish listening professionally. The final 2 minutes of the track became increasingly chaotic, with the background voices and sounds growing more prominent beneath the music. What I'd initially perceived as artistic ambient noise now sounded like a deliberate attempt to mask something disturbing. The screams, though still distant, seemed to multiply. And underneath it all, there was a rhythmic sound I couldn't quite identify. Mechanical, repetitive, When the track finally ended, I sat in silence for several minutes. A rational part of my brain was saying that Alex had simply created a disturbing piece of experimental music. Maybe he'd sampled horror movies or found some creepy sounds online. But another part of me, the part that had spent years training to distinguish subtle details in audio, was deeply unsettled. I played the track again, this time opening it in my professional audio software where I could visualize the sound waves and separate the frequencies. With the proper tools, I began isolating different layers of the recording. The main musical elements were clearly composed and synthetic, as expected, but the background field recordings appeared to be a single continuous audio file that had been processed to sound distant. When I isolated this layer and enhanced it, what I heard made me physically recoil from my desk. It was unmistakably people in extreme distress, multiple voices begging, screaming, crying. The mechanical sound I'd noticed was clearer now too, something repetitive and metallic, like a crank or lever being operated. And beneath it all, almost imperceptible even with enhancement, was a voice speaking calmly, methodically, giving instructions. I felt physically sick. This couldn't be some creative sample Alex had found. It was too raw, too consistent. It sounded like genuine audio of people being tortured. With shaking hands, I sent Alex a message, asking about the source of the field recordings. His response came quickly. Just some stuff I found in an interesting corner of the web. Thought it added a unique atmosphere. Too intense? That vague answer only increased my unease. I pressed him, asking directly if he knew what the voices in the background were. He replied that he hadn't noticed any distinct voices, just atmospheric noise. Either he was lying, or he genuinely hadn't heard what was clearly audible to my trained ear once I knew to look for it. Neither option was comforting. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about what I'd heard and what it might mean. The next morning, I decided to extract the background audio layer completely and run it through additional filters to clean it up further. What emerged was far worse than I'd initially thought. The clearer audio revealed what sounded like a methodical session where someone was calmly directing the torture of multiple people. The most disturbing part was that the voice occasionally referenced viewers or an audience, as if this was being streamed or recorded specifically for others to watch. I'd heard of red rooms on the dark web, supposedly live streams of torture or worse that people paid to watch. Most experts said they were urban legends, technically impossible to stream reliably through Tor networks. But what if they were real? What if instead of streaming video, which requires significant bandwidth, they distributed high-quality audio recordings afterward? I felt caught in an impossible situation. If what I'd heard was real, it was evidence of horrific crimes. But going to the police would mean explaining how I came to possess it, potentially implicating myself and definitely implicating Alex. And would they even take it seriously? It would sound insane. Claims of hidden torture audio in an experimental music track. I decided to dig deeper first. I checked the audio file's metadata, looking for any clues about its origin. The original field recording had been created 3 months earlier, according to the timestamp. But more disturbing was a hidden comment in the metadata, a string of random characters followed by .onion, unmistakably a dark web address. That night, Alex sent me another message asking what I thought of the track. I gave him some vague technical feedback, afraid to reveal what I'd discovered. He seemed pleased and mentioned he had more experimental audio he'd like my opinion on, if I was interested. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid. What if Alex was involved in something terrible? What if he was testing me somehow, seeing if I would notice the hidden sounds? Or worse, what if he wasn't the one who put them there at all? What if someone had compromised his computer or accounts? A week after receiving the track, I received an anonymous email. The subject line was simply those same random characters I'd found in the metadata. The body contained only 2 sentences. "We noticed you've been listening very carefully. Would you like to hear more?" I immediately deleted the email and shut down my computer. My hands were shaking so badly I spilled my drink across my desk. Someone knew I'd isolated that audio. Someone was watching. I haven't responded to any of Alex's messages since then. I bought a new laptop and phone. I stay at different friends' houses, never in my own flat for more than a few hours to collect essentials. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if I'm being followed. The worst part is the uncertainty. Was what I heard actually real? Or was it an elaborate hoax? Is Alex involved? Or is he being used somehow? And who sent that email? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, and I'm too afraid to keep looking. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I can hear those screams again, hidden beneath the normal sounds of the world around me. And I wonder how many other recordings like that are out there, with horrors hidden in their background noise, waiting for someone with the right ear to discover them. I probably shouldn't be telling you this. Even now, months later, I find myself looking over my shoulder when I walk to the corner shop or checking the locks twice before bed. But I suppose someone should know what happened, and writing it down makes it feel less like something I imagined. It started with boredom, really, the kind of restless curiosity that hits you when you're stuck in a bedsit in Birmingham with nothing but a laptop and too much time on your hands. I'd been made redundant from my job at the council offices, and whilst I was applying for new positions during the day, the evenings stretched endlessly ahead of me. I'd heard about the dark web, of course. Everyone has. The hidden internet where you can supposedly find anything if you know where to look. Not that I was after anything particularly sinister. I wasn't trying to buy illegal substances or hire an assassin. I was just curious about what was actually there, beneath all the sensationalist headlines and urban legends. Getting access wasn't as complicated as I'd expected. A few searches on regular Google led me to the necessary software, and within an hour I was browsing sites with addresses that looked like random strings of letters and numbers. Most of it was disappointingly mundane. Forums discussing privacy, marketplaces selling perfectly legal items, and a lot of broken links. But there was one site that caught my attention. It had a simple black background with white text, and it was called The Registry. At first glance, it looked like some sort of directory or database. The homepage was sparse, just a search box, and a brief description explaining that it was a comprehensive listing service for various purposes. I spent several evenings browsing through the registry's categories. There were sections for services, products, information exchanges, all described in deliberately vague language that could have meant anything. It reminded me of classified ads from local newspapers, the sort where people advertise household items for sale, but use oddly formal language that makes you wonder what they're really offering. The section that drew me in was labeled simply as personal records. When I clicked on it, I found what appeared to be a vast collection of detailed profiles. Each entry contained a photograph and extensive personal information: full names, addresses, daily routines, family members, workplace details, even seemingly random observations about habits and preferences. I initially assumed these were fictional profiles, perhaps for creative writing projects or role-playing games. The level of detail was impressive. One entry described a woman named Sarah Thompson from Leeds, including her regular coffee shop, her mother's maiden name, her habit of leaving her kitchen window slightly open overnight, and the fact that she always took the same route home from her job at a local library. The photographs looked genuine rather than stock images. They showed ordinary people going about their daily business. A man unlocking his car, a woman walking her dog, someone collecting posts from their doorstep. The quality suggested they'd been taken with a decent camera from a reasonable distance, not the blurry surveillance footage you might expect. What made me uncomfortable was how current everything seemed. The clothing in the photos looked contemporary, and many of the entries included recent details like started new position at Morrison's last month, or recently moved to ground floor flat due to mobility issues. These weren't historical records or fictional creations. They appeared to document real people living real lives right now. I started searching for familiar names, just out of curiosity. I tried my own name first, then my former colleagues from the council office. Nothing came up for me, but I found an entry for Trevor Walsh, who'd worked in accounts before I was made redundant. His profile included his home address in Erdington, details about his divorced status, and even mentioned that he'd started wearing reading glasses in the past year. The photograph showed Trevor walking out of our old office building. I recognized the distinctive red brick facade and the car park where I used to eat my lunch. The image had clearly been taken some time after I left, because Trevor was wearing a jacket I'd never seen him in before. I should have stopped looking then, should have closed the laptop and found something else to occupy my evenings. But there's something compulsive about discovering information you're not supposed to have access to. It's like reading someone else's diary or overhearing a private telephone conversation. Morally questionable, but difficult to resist. I began searching for other people I knew, my former neighbors, old school friends, relatives I'd lost touch with over the years. Most searches came up empty, but occasionally I'd find a match that made my skin crawl. My cousin Linda appeared in the database. She lived in Wolverhampton with her husband and 2 teenage daughters, and according to her profile, she was struggling financially since her husband's hours had been cut at the factory. The entry included photographs of her house, not just the street view, but images that appeared to have been taken from her back garden, showing the kitchen window and the door to her utility room. More disturbing still was a section titled Behavioral Observations. This contained detailed notes about Linda's routines, written in a clinical, detached style. It mentioned that she usually left for work at 8:15, that she had a habit of checking her phone while waiting for buses, and that she often stayed up late watching television when her family had gone to bed. I wanted to warn Linda, but how could I explain how I discovered this information? How do you tell someone that their private life is being documented by strangers on the dark web without admitting that you've been browsing these sites yourself? Instead, I kept searching. I told myself I was gathering evidence, that I'd eventually find a way to report this to the authorities once I understood the scale of what I was looking at. But really, I think I was just horrified enough to be fascinated. The database was enormous. I could spend hours clicking through profiles of people from across the UK, each one containing intimate details about their lives, relationships, and vulnerabilities. There were elderly people living alone, single parents struggling to manage work and childcare, individuals dealing with health problems or financial difficulties. What struck me most was how ordinary these people were. These weren't celebrities or public figures whose lives might be considered fair game for scrutiny. They were postmen and shop assistants and retired teachers. People who'd never done anything to attract attention or invite surveillance. After about a week of browsing through the registry, I noticed something that made me stop clicking for several minutes. At the bottom of each profile page was a small line of text I'd previously overlooked. It read, last updated, followed by a date and timestamp. All the profiles I'd been viewing had been updated within the past month. Many had been updated within the past week. Some had timestamps from just days earlier. This wasn't historical data or information compiled from public records. Someone was actively maintaining these profiles, adding new photographs and updating personal details on a regular basis. Someone was watching these people, documenting their lives, and keeping meticulous records of their activities and habits. I started paying closer attention to the update timestamps. Linda's profile had been refreshed 3 days ago. Trevor's had been updated the previous afternoon. These weren't casual observations gathered occasionally. They were the result of systematic, ongoing surveillance. The implications were staggering. Hundreds, possibly thousands of ordinary people were being monitored without their knowledge. Someone was tracking their movements, photographing their homes, and building detailed databases of their personal information. I began to wonder about the purpose behind all this surveillance. The registry wasn't presenting itself as a law enforcement database or a legitimate business directory. It existed on the dark web for a reason, and that reason clearly wasn't benevolent. The profiles reminded me of target assessments, the kind of detailed intelligence gathering that would be useful if you wanted to manipulate, blackmail, or harm someone. Each entry contained exactly the sort of information a stalker or burglar would find valuable. When people were home alone, which windows they left unlocked, what their financial vulnerabilities might be. One evening, whilst browsing through profiles of people from Manchester, I came across an entry that made me feel physically sick. The photograph showed a young woman I recognized from a true crime documentary I'd watched several months earlier. She'd been murdered in her flat last year, and the case had received significant media coverage because the killer had never been caught. But here she was in the registry, with a profile that had been created weeks before her death. The entry contained detailed information about her daily routine, her work schedule, and even mentioned that she often forgot to lock her patio door when she came home from evening shifts. The profile's final update had occurred 2 days before her murder. I stared at that timestamp for a long time, trying to convince myself there was some innocent explanation. Perhaps the database had been compiled from newspaper reports after the fact, or maybe the timestamps were inaccurate. But the level of personal detail in her profile was far more extensive than anything that had appeared in the media coverage of her death. I started searching for other names from news reports, focusing on unsolved cases from the past couple of years. I found 3 more matches, all victims of crimes that had attracted media attention, all with profiles that predated their deaths by weeks or months. The evidence was circumstantial but disturbing. Either the registry was documenting potential victims before crimes occurred, or it was being used by people who went on to commit those crimes. I should have contacted the police immediately, should have printed screenshots and taken my concerns to the authorities, regardless of how I discovered the information. But I was paralyzed by the implications of what I'd found and uncertain whether anyone would believe me. Instead, I kept returning to the registry night after night, compulsively searching for new entries and monitoring the updates to existing profiles. I told myself I was conducting my own investigation, but really, I think I was just trapped in a cycle of morbid fascination. Then, on a Thursday evening in late November, I searched for my own name again. This time, there was a match. My profile included my current address in Birmingham, a recent photograph of me leaving the local supermarket, and detailed information about my daily habits. The entry mentioned my recent redundancy, my evening walks to the corner shop, and even noted that I tended to stay up late using my laptop. The behavioral observations section contained information that no casual observer could have gathered. It mentioned that I usually left my bedroom window slightly open at night, that I had a habit of checking my phone immediately after waking up, and that I often ordered takeaway food on Friday evenings. Most disturbing of all was a note about my browsing habits. The profile mentioned that I spent considerable time online in the evenings and had recently begun accessing restricted areas of the internet. They knew I'd been using the dark web. They knew I'd found the registry. The timestamp showed that my profile had been updated that morning. I closed the laptop immediately and spent the rest of the evening checking the locks on my door and windows, peering through the curtains to see if anyone was watching the building. Every sound from the street made me jump, and I found myself wondering how long I'd been under surveillance without realizing it. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. I stopped going for evening walks and started varying my routine as much as possible. I ordered groceries online instead of visiting the shops, and I avoided using my laptop after dark in case someone could see the glow from my window. But I couldn't stop thinking about the registry and all those other profiles I'd seen. Hundreds of people were being watched and documented, and some of them might be in genuine danger. My own fear was insignificant compared to the broader implications of what I'd discovered. I decided to contact the police. I prepared a detailed statement explaining how I'd found the database, including screenshots and specific examples of profiles that corresponded with unsolved crimes. I even researched which department would be most appropriate for handling this kind of evidence. Before submitting my report, I decided to check the registry one final time to ensure my information was current and accurate. My profile had been updated again. This time, the entry included a note that I had been preparing to contact law enforcement authorities. It mentioned specific details about my planned report, including the names of the victims I'd identified and the evidence I'd gathered. The timestamp was from less than an hour earlier. Someone had been monitoring my online activities in real time. They knew exactly what I was planning to do, and they documented it in my profile before I'd even made my decision final. I deleted my prepared statement and closed my laptop. I've barely used it since, except to apply for jobs and handle essential business. I found new employment within a few weeks, and I've tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal routine, but I still think about the registry constantly. I wonder whether those profiles are still being maintained, whether new entries are being added, and whether the information is being used for the purposes I suspect. I wonder whether other people have discovered the database and what they've done with that knowledge. Most of all, I wonder whether my own profile is still there, still being updated with observations about my current behavior and activities, whether someone is still watching me, documenting my attempts to move on and forget what I found. I suppose I'll never know for certain. And perhaps that's the most disturbing part of all, the knowledge that this surveillance could continue indefinitely, invisible and undetectable, until someone decides to act on the information they've gathered. I've never tried to access the registry again, and I've no intention of doing so. But sometimes, when I'm walking to work or sitting in my flat in the evening, I catch myself wondering whether someone is watching me, adding new observations to my profile, noting my continued attempts to live a quiet, unremarkable life. The thought that my efforts to remain invisible might themselves be worth documenting is perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. So this happened about 3 years ago when I was still at sixth form in Leeds. You know how schools are about internet safety and all that? Well, there's a good reason for it, and I found out the hard way. I was in the library after hours, thought I was alone, and decided to check out the dark web. Biggest mistake of my life. I still get chills thinking about it. That night, I wasn't just browsing the dark web, it was browsing me back. I've never actually told anyone the full story until now. I kept quiet because, honestly, I was scared that whoever was watching me that night might find out. Even now, I still catch myself checking over my shoulder or covering my webcam. I guess I should start from the beginning. I was in my final year at sixth form college in Leeds, studying computer science among other subjects. I'd always been fascinated by technology, probably to an unhealthy degree if I'm being honest. My parents had divorced when I was 14, and I'd retreated into the digital world as a coping mechanism. By 16, I was already fairly proficient at coding and had developed an interest in cybersecurity. It started innocently enough, learning about encryption, firewalls, that sort of thing. But as is often the case with teenage curiosity, it didn't stay innocent for long. I first heard about the dark web from a friend in my computer science class. He was always talking about conspiracy theories and government surveillance, most of which I dismissed as paranoid ramblings. But when he mentioned Tor browsers and onion routing, my interest was piqued. I remember thinking it sounded like something from a spy film, not something accessible to ordinary people like me. How wrong I was. It was mid-November, and the days were already darkening by 4 in the afternoon. I'd stayed behind after classes to work on a coding project in the college library. The library was housed in an old Victorian building with high ceilings and tall windows that let in very little light during winter months. By 5:30 p.m., most students had gone home, leaving the vast space eerily quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of the librarian restacking books and the soft hum of computers. I'd been working at one of the computers in the far corner of the library, tucked away behind several tall bookcases. It was my favorite spot because no one could see my screen unless they were standing directly behind me. In retrospect, that should have been my first warning. If I could hide my screen from others, others could hide their activities from me. I'd downloaded Tor browser onto a USB drive at home, bypassing the college's security protocols that prevented direct downloads. I wasn't planning on doing anything particularly nefarious, just exploring, seeing what all the fuss was about. I told myself it was academic curiosity, that I was a computer science student after all, and understanding all facets of the internet was part of my education. Such convenient justifications we create for ourselves. The library was practically empty by then. The only other person I could see was a first-year student dozing over textbooks several tables away. The librarian had retreated to her office. I plugged in my USB, launched Tor, and took my first steps into the dark web. At first, it was disappointingly mundane. Slow-loading pages with basic interfaces, mostly forums discussing privacy and encryption. I remember feeling slightly let down, thinking that this was what everyone was so worried about. But then I found a link to a directory of sorts, a signpost to the deeper, darker corners of this hidden internet. I started clicking through, fascinated by the sheer volume of illegal marketplaces, hacking services, and forums dedicated to activities I'd rather not detail. I remember the exact moment when things took a turn. I'd clicked on a link claiming to offer live streams of various security cameras from around the world. The page that loaded had a grid of thumbnail videos, some showing empty office corridors, others displaying street corners or the interiors of what looked like shops after hours. It was unsettling, but also oddly compelling. This voyeuristic window into places I'd never visit, and people who had no idea they were being watched. One thumbnail caught my attention. Unlike the others, which showed static scenes with occasional movement, this one had a red border around it and a counter showing how many people were watching. 23 at that moment. The thumbnail itself was dark, showing what appeared to be a dimly lit room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked. The video expanded to fill most of my screen. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust to the low light, but gradually I could make out what seemed to be a bedroom. The camera angle was from a corner near the ceiling, pointing down at a bed where someone appeared to be sleeping. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. This wasn't some public security camera. This was someone's private space being invaded. I was about to close the window when the sleeping figure stirred, and I froze. It was a young woman, probably not much older than me. She sat up, checking her phone, completely unaware that strangers across the internet were watching her most private moments. I remember thinking I should close the browser immediately, that watching even another second made me complicit in this violation. But before I could move the cursor to the X, something in the live chat sidebar caught my eye. Someone with the username Observer Prime had written something that made my blood turn to ice. They somehow knew I was watching from Leeds College Library. They actually welcomed me to the show. How could they possibly know where I was? I hadn't entered any personal information, hadn't accepted any cookies or permissions. I frantically checked if my webcam light was on. It wasn't. Still, panic began to rise in my throat. I closed the tab immediately, hands shaking so badly I nearly knocked over my water bottle. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the college's network wasn't as secure as it should be when using Tor. Maybe my IP address was visible despite the supposed anonymity. I told myself it was just a scare tactic, something to freak out newcomers. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I shut down Tor and was about to pull out my USB when a chat window popped up on my screen. This shouldn't have been possible. The college computers had all communication apps blocked. The message told me not to leave yet, that the show was just starting. I looked around wildly, certain someone must be watching me physically, playing some elaborate prank. But the library remained still and silent. The first-year student had left. Even the librarian was nowhere to be seen. I was alone, or at least I appeared to be. Another message appeared, telling me to look back at the screen, that she was about to get a surprise visitor. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself reopening Tor, navigating back to the stream. The young woman was now sitting at a desk in the corner of her room, working on a laptop, headphones on. The view switched to another camera angle, this one showing her apartment door from the outside. A figure in a dark hoodie was standing there, quietly testing the handle. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips as they hovered over the keyboard. This couldn't be real. It had to be staged, some sick form of entertainment. But the terror felt authentic as the door slowly eased open, the woman completely unaware due to her headphones. I wanted to warn her somehow, to scream through the screen, but I was just another silent observer in this horror show. That's when I noticed something that turned my fear for her into fear for myself. In the corner of my screen, a small window had opened, showing me, from behind, at my library computer, in real time. I whipped around, nearly falling out of my chair. There was no one there, just rows of empty desks and bookshelves. But when I turned back to the screen, the angle had changed. Now it was showing me from the side, capturing my profile illuminated by the glow of the monitor. There had to be a camera somewhere, but I couldn't spot it no matter where I looked. The chat was active now, with multiple users commenting. Some were talking about having 2 shows for the price of 1. Others mentioned how the watcher becomes the watched. The most disturbing comments were asking which one they should visit first. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely use the mouse. I closed Tor again, yanked out my USB, and gathered my things to leave. As I stood up, all the computers in the library suddenly turned on by themselves, each screen showing the same image. Me, standing there, frozen in terror. I abandoned my belongings and ran, bursting through the library doors and not stopping until I reached the college's main entrance. Outside, the winter air stung my lungs as I gasped for breath, trying to process what had just happened. I was about to call for a taxi when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message said they knew where I lived too, but not to worry. They weren't visiting tonight. They liked to save the best shows for later. For weeks afterward, I barely slept. I reformatted my computer, changed all my passwords, even stayed at a friend's house for a few days. I couldn't bring myself to return to the library, making up excuses about illness to explain my absence from classes. When I finally did go back to college, I avoided all computers, completing assignments at home on a laptop I'd stripped down and rebuilt to ensure it had no webcam or microphone. The messages stopped after that first night, but the damage was done. I'd glimpsed a world where privacy was an illusion, where watchers could become the watched in an instant. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? And more importantly, what if reporting it triggered whoever was behind those cameras to make good on their implied threat? That was 3 years ago. I've since moved cities, changed my name on social media, and adopted an almost paranoid approach to online security. I never use public Wi-Fi, keep my webcam covered, and regularly check for unusual network activity. Perhaps it was all an elaborate scare tactic, a way to frighten naive explorers of the dark web. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my flat late at night, I still feel eyes on me, invisible observers waiting for the next show to begin. So if you're reading this and feeling that same curiosity I once did about the dark web, take my advice. Some doors are better left unopened, because once you've seen what's on the other side, you can never unsee it. And worse still, once they've seen you, they never forget. The scariest part isn't what I witnessed that night. It's the knowledge that at any moment I might become the unwitting star of someone else's Red Room stream. And unlike that poor woman in the bedroom, I'd know exactly what that means. Let me tell you about my friend John Paul and why he'll never feel safe on land again. He wasn't the sort of person you'd expect to end up living on a yacht. He'd been a history teacher at a comprehensive in Glasgow for the better part of 20 years. The kind of steady, reliable guy who marked papers on Sunday evenings and took the same 2 weeks off every summer. Then everything changed when he won a raffle. It wasn't a huge win, mind you, but enough to transform his life. After all of the arrangements were sorted, he found himself the proud owner of a beautiful 45-foot motor yacht. She was a proper luxury vessel with polished wood fittings, a spacious salon, comfortable sleeping quarters, and all the modern amenities including satellite internet. He discovered he could teach online from anywhere with a stable connection, and the freedom of waking up to different horizons each morning was intoxicating. He'd been living aboard for about 18 months when I first visited him. The yacht was moored in a quiet bay off the Dorset coast, far enough from shore that the lights of the nearest village were just pinpricks in the darkness. He seemed genuinely happy for the first time since I'd known him, tanned from the sun and relaxed in a way that years of classroom management had never allowed. The boat was immaculate, well maintained and loved, with comfortable furnishings and enough space to feel like a proper home. Though when I mentioned how peaceful it must be, he glanced toward the shore with an expression I couldn't quite read. We spent the evening catching up over a few drinks, and as the conversation wound down, he mentioned something that stayed with me. He'd been exploring parts of the internet he'd never bothered with before, partly out of boredom during the long evenings at Anchor, partly from curiosity about what existed beyond the usual websites everyone used. He wasn't particularly technical, but he taught himself just enough networking to be dangerous. The hidden networks beneath the surface web fascinated him. The anonymity appealed to him, the sense of being able to observe without being observed. But over the past few weeks, he'd stumbled across something that unsettled him. A series of linked sites offering live streaming services, but not the kind you'd find on mainstream platforms. These streams showed real people in real situations, often without their knowledge, sometimes against their will. He described it as a network of interconnected feeds, some showing seemingly innocent content like people in their homes or workplaces, others displaying scenarios orchestrated for the viewer's entertainment. The most disturbing aspect was the interactive element. Viewers could influence what happened on screen through various means, turning passive observation into active participation. What bothered him most was how professional the operation appeared. This wasn't some amateur setup run by a handful of perverts in their spare time. The streaming quality was excellent, the user interface sophisticated, and the whole system seemed designed to handle thousands of concurrent viewers. Someone was running this with serious resources and technical expertise. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I could tell the subject was weighing on his mind. He had always been the sort of person who felt responsible for fixing problems, even when they weren't his to solve. I suspected he was wrestling with whether to report what he'd found, though to whom and with what evidence, I couldn't say. I left the next morning, returning to my own routine in London, and didn't think much more about our conversation until he called me a few weeks later. His voice was different, strained in a way I'd never heard before. The streaming network had evolved since our last conversation. New sections had appeared, offering more extreme content, and more people were watching. But the change that terrified him was personal. He'd recognized one of the locations being streamed. It was his yacht. The feed showed his main cabin from an impossible angle, as if the camera was positioned inside the paneling itself. He could see his comfortable seating area, his navigation station, even the books he'd left open on the polished dining table. The image quality was crystal clear, updating in real time, showing every detail of his private space. At first, he thought it might be some kind of technical error or coincidence, but when he moved around the spacious cabin, his actions reflected on the stream with no delay. Someone had somehow placed surveillance equipment inside his beautiful yacht without his knowledge. Thousands of strangers were watching his every move. The chat beside the stream was filled with comments about him, discussions of his daily routine, speculation about his background and personal life. Some viewers seemed to know details about his past that weren't publicly available, suggesting they'd researched him extensively. Others were making suggestions about what should happen next, treating his situation like entertainment. He had immediately started searching his vessel for hidden cameras, but found nothing obvious. The equipment had to be there somewhere, capturing video and audio, transmitting it to the streaming network, but it was concealed well enough that an amateur search revealed nothing. More troubling was the realization that this level of surveillance required serious planning and resources. Someone had accessed his boat, possibly multiple times, to install the necessary equipment. They'd studied his movements, learned his patterns, and chosen their moment carefully. This wasn't random targeting. It was a deliberate operation focused on him. He tried various approaches to regain his privacy. He covered every surface that might conceal a camera, disconnected his internet connection, even moved to different anchorages. But the stream continued, suggesting the surveillance system was more sophisticated than he'd initially thought. He attempted to contact other boat owners through marine radio, hoping to warn them or find allies, but his transmissions were met with silence or interference, The worst part was the interactivity and how quickly it escalated. The chat messages shifted from commentary to direct instructions, asking him to retrieve specific objects, move to certain areas of the boat, even step outside at designated times. At first, he dismissed them as trolls, but when he ignored the requests, strange disruptions followed. His GPS would drop out. The weather forecast he'd checked an hour earlier would suddenly show different data. His generator failed twice without clear cause. It was possible these were all coincidences, but the timing was too precise, too convenient. Someone was manipulating his environment, making his life aboard increasingly difficult, forcing him to comply with the viewer's wishes simply to maintain basic comfort and safety. He tried to report the situation to the authorities, but explaining the problem proved almost impossible. The streaming sites were accessible only through hidden networks. The evidence was ephemeral, and his situation sounded far-fetched even to his own ears. The police were polite but skeptical. The Coast Guard suggested he might be suffering from isolation-induced paranoia, and his internet service provider insisted their systems were secure. Meanwhile, the stream audience continued to grow. The viewer count reached several thousand, and the chat was now moderated by users who seemed to have administrative privileges. They organized the other viewers, coordinating their demands, turning his imprisonment into structured entertainment. The breaking point came when he realized the surveillance wasn't limited to his boat. The streaming network had expanded to include feeds from the shoreline, showing the bay where he was anchored, the nearby village, even the road leading to the marina. Someone was tracking his movements across a much wider area than he'd initially understood. Even more disturbing was the discovery that other boats in the area were also being monitored. The network included streams from various vessels, some with people aboard who seemed unaware they were being watched. Others apparently empty, but still under surveillance. The operation was far larger than a single yacht, covering what appeared to be the entire coastal region. He spent several sleepless nights trying to understand the scope of what he'd uncovered. The streaming network wasn't showing random locations. It was systematically monitoring a specific geographical area. Every boat, every building, every person within a certain radius was potentially being watched by thousands of anonymous viewers. He tried creating anonymous accounts on various forums, attempting to alert others to what was happening. But his posts were quickly deleted and his access revoked. When he tried to document the streams by taking screenshots, his computer would crash. Every attempt to gather evidence or reach out for help was somehow thwarted. The realization that he was trapped pushed him toward panic. He couldn't leave without being tracked, couldn't stay without being watched, couldn't contact anyone without his communications being monitored. Every choice he made was being observed and judged by an audience that viewed his situation as entertainment. The technical sophistication required for this level of surveillance was staggering. Someone had installed cameras and tracking equipment across miles of coastline, established a network capable of handling thousands of simultaneous video streams, and created a user interface that allowed viewers to interact with the content in real time. The resources involved suggested either a very wealthy individual or a well-funded organization with access to military-grade surveillance technology. His attempts to escape were also systematically thwarted. When he tried to sail away from the monitored area, his engine would develop problems, or his navigation equipment would malfunction. When he attempted to call for help, his radio would experience interference, or his mobile signal would disappear. Every route to freedom was blocked by technical difficulties that seemed too convenient to be accidental. The psychological pressure became unbearable. He was constantly aware of being watched, unable to relax even in what should have been the privacy of his own boat. He'd taken to sleeping in different locations each night, covering himself with blankets to avoid the cameras, but he knew these were futile gestures. The surveillance system was too comprehensive, too well designed to be defeated by such simple measures. The chat messages grew increasingly invasive, with viewers discussing intimate details of his life, making predictions about his behavior, treating him like a character in a reality television show. Some messages were sympathetic, expressing concern for his well-being, but others were cruel, suggesting ways to increase his distress for their amusement. He began to suspect that his situation was part of a larger experiment or entertainment program. The systematic nature of the surveillance, the careful manipulation of his environment, the organized response from the viewing audience all suggested a level of planning that went beyond simple voyeurism. The most terrifying aspect was the growing realization that escape might not be possible. The surveillance network covered such a wide area that leaving meant venturing into unknown territory, where the monitoring might be even more comprehensive. The technical capabilities demonstrated so far suggested resources and expertise that made traditional law enforcement seem inadequate to address the situation. Days passed. The isolation was absolute. He was surrounded by water, trapped in a situation that sounded so bizarre that even his closest friends would struggle to believe it. The anonymous viewers became his only connection to other people, but they saw him as entertainment rather than a human being in distress. During one of his more desperate attempts to trace the source of the stream, he stumbled across what looked like an internal admin panel, likely exposed through a forgotten link or outdated login. It wasn't polished or secure, but it revealed more than he was meant to see. There was a basic map showing streaming points all along the British coastline, with hundreds of active feeds, not just from boats, but from ports, coastal roads, even remote cottages. It became clear the system was organized. Different regions were broken up into sections, each apparently managed by separate user groups who shared data between them. The layout, the consistency, the scale of it all. This wasn't just some underground voyeur ring. The coordination and resources involved made it feel like something far more serious. He started to wonder if what he'd uncovered wasn't just a criminal enterprise, but part of a larger commercial or even state-run operation. The viewer numbers were staggering, reaching into the hundreds of thousands during peak times, with users paying substantial fees for access to different levels of content. The interactive elements allowed viewers to influence events in real time, creating a form of reality entertainment that generated enormous revenues for the operators. He said he found evidence suggesting that the operation had been running for several years, expanding gradually as the technology improved and the audience grew. The early streams had been crude and limited, but the current system was capable of providing high-definition video and audio from multiple angles, with sophisticated image processing that could track individuals even in crowded environments. The realization that he was just one of thousands of unwilling participants was both terrifying and oddly comforting. He wasn't being specifically targeted. He was simply unlucky enough to have discovered his own surveillance, while most others remained ignorant of theirs. But this knowledge also made his situation more hopeless. If the operation was as large and well-funded as the evidence suggested, then individual escape was unlikely. Our phone conversations became less frequent as his situation deteriorated. His voice grew weaker each time we spoke, the strain of constant vigilance taking its toll. He'd been eating poorly, sleeping in brief snatches, jumping at every sound that might indicate someone approaching his boat. The final call came a few weeks ago. He told me that something had changed about the streaming feeds. The cameras were still active, still transmitting his every move to the anonymous audience, but the interactive elements had been disabled. The viewers could watch, but no longer influence what happened to him. He interpreted this as a warning. His discovery of the administrative sections, his knowledge of the operation's scope, had marked him as a security risk. The psychological effect was devastating. Being watched for entertainment was horrible, but being watched as a potential threat was worse. He knew that any action he took, any attempt to contact authorities or escape his situation, would be immediately detected and countered. One morning, something changed. He woke to find his internet connection severed, his satellite communication system disabled, and his radio producing only static. For the first time in months, he was truly alone. The silence was both terrifying and liberating. Without the constant awareness of being watched, he felt a freedom he'd almost forgotten existed. But he also knew that this isolation was probably temporary, a prelude to something more permanent. The radio on his yacht crackled to life several days later. His hands shook as he reached for the handset, having heard nothing but static for so long that he'd almost forgotten what human voices sounded like. The transmission was clear and official, identifying itself as Falmouth Coast Guard. They were responding to reports of a vessel in distress, requesting his current position and status. His heart raced as he realized this might be his chance, his opportunity to finally escape the surveillance network that held him prisoner for so long. But as he prepared to respond, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The radio display showed an incoming frequency that wasn't used by the Coast Guard, and the voice, while professional, had an undertone he recognized from his months of captivity. His finger hovered over the transmit button as he considered his options. He could share his exact position and hope for genuine rescue, or he could remain silent and maintain his current status as a managed prisoner. Either choice might be wrong, but only one offered the possibility of freedom. The voice repeated its request, growing more insistent, demanding his immediate response. He closed his eyes, made his decision, and pressed the button to share his coordinates. I've been sitting on this experience for nearly 8 months now. I haven't told anyone about it. Not my friends, not my family. Definitely not any professional who might be obligated to report it. But it's eating me up inside. So maybe writing it down will help me process what happened. Maybe someone else has gone through something similar and can tell me it gets better. I don't know. I'm a software developer living in Bristol. Pretty ordinary bloke. Studied computer science at university, worked a few jobs in London before moving back to my hometown for a better quality of life. I've always been the cautious type when it comes to technology, using different passwords, keeping my antivirus updated, that sort of thing. Ironic, really, considering what happened. It started when I was cleaning out some old accounts. I'd been reading about data breaches and decided it was time to close down any dormant accounts I wasn't using anymore. I made a list of old email addresses, social media profiles, and forum registrations I'd abandoned over the years. Most of these dated back to university or even earlier. Accounts I'd created in my teens and eventually outgrown. One of these was an old Hotmail address I'd used primarily during my first year at uni, around 2008. I hadn't logged into it for at least a decade, and I was surprised it even still existed. I expected it would be deactivated for inactivity, but when I entered what I thought might have been the password, it actually logged me in. The interface had changed completely since I'd last seen it, but there was my inbox, filled with ancient newsletters, spam, and forgotten conversations with people I no longer spoke to. Out of curiosity, I started scrolling through some of the old emails. Most were mundane. assignment discussions with classmates, sign-up confirmations for websites that probably no longer existed, promotional emails from companies I'd forgotten about, nostalgic, but nothing particularly interesting. I was about to log out and submit the account for deletion when I noticed something odd. There was a new email at the very top of the inbox, received just 3 days earlier. The subject line was simply a string of numbers and letters that looked like some kind of code or identifier. The sender's address was equally cryptic. Just another alphanumeric string, followed by a domain I didn't recognize. My first thought was that it was probably just sophisticated spam that had somehow made it through the filters. Still, it seemed strange that a decade-dormant email account would suddenly receive something like this. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The body of the email was brief, just a single line of text saying they were next unless I watched, followed by what appeared to be a link to a website with a .onion domain. Below that was a countdown timer, actively ticking away, showing just under 18 hours remaining. I knew enough about technology to recognize that .onion domains were part of the dark web, accessible only through specialized browsers like Tor. I'd never actually been on the dark web myself, though I'd heard plenty about it. Illegal marketplaces, hacking forums, and worse things that most people preferred not to think about. My first instinct was to ignore it and continue with deleting the account. It was probably just some bizarre phishing attempt targeting old, potentially compromised email addresses. But something about the countdown timer bothered me. It wasn't a static image or generic animation. It was actively synced to real time, ticking down second by second. That level of sophistication seemed unusual for random spam. Out of professional curiosity, more than anything else, I decided to do a bit of research. I didn't click the link, but I did search for information about similar emails or scams involving countdown timers and .onion domains. Most of what I found was fairly innocuous. Discussions about phishing techniques, warnings about dark web scams, that sort of thing. Then I came across a thread on a cybersecurity forum where someone described receiving an almost identical email. They had clicked the link and been taken to what they described as a red room, a live stream showing someone being held captive. According to their post, the stream ended abruptly when the countdown reached 0, and they received another email shortly after with a new link and a new countdown. I told myself it had to be an urban legend. Red rooms were widely considered to be myths, the stuff of creepypastas and internet horror stories, rather than actual dark web content. The technological infrastructure required to stream high-quality video through Tor would be impractical, and the risks for anyone operating such a site would be enormous. Still, the similarity to what I'd received was unsettling. I closed the forum and went back to the email, staring at that countdown timer as it continued its relentless progression. 17 hours and 26 minutes remaining. What if it wasn't a myth? What if there really was someone on the other end of that link whose fate somehow depended on people watching? I tried to rationalize it. Even if such things did exist, how would my viewing or not viewing affect anything? The idea that someone's life could depend on whether random recipients of a strange email clicked a link was absurd. It had to be a sick psychological game at best, a scam to drive traffic to malware-infected sites at worst. I closed the email and tried to forget about it, went about my day as normal, worked on some freelance projects, went to the gym, met a friend for drinks. But throughout it all, that countdown kept nagging at the back of my mind. By the time I got home that evening, I found myself logging back into the old email account. The timer now showed 9 hours and 12 minutes. I don't know exactly what made me download the Tor browser that night. Curiosity, concern, some misguided sense of responsibility. Whatever it was, I found myself following online guides to set it up securely, telling myself I was just being thorough in my investigation before dismissing the whole thing. With about 8 hours left on the countdown, I clicked the link. I expected it to lead nowhere, or perhaps to some crude scam site asking for Bitcoin. Instead, it took me to a minimalist page with another countdown timer matching the one in the email, and beneath it, a video player that wasn't yet active. A message indicated that the stream would begin when the countdown reached 0. There was also a viewer counter showing 41 people currently on the page. That detail made it feel more real somehow. Not just a personalized scam targeting me, but something multiple people were experiencing simultaneously. I closed the browser immediately, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. I tried to sleep, but couldn't stop thinking about what might happen when that timer reached 0. Would nothing happen, confirming it was just an elaborate hoax? Or would something unspeakable begin? Something I could perhaps have prevented by watching, as the email had implied. At around 3 a.m., with roughly 3 hours left on the countdown, I made the decision that still haunts me. I reopened Tor, clicked the link again, and waited. The viewer count had risen to 126. I left the tab open and tried to distract myself with work, checking back periodically as the minutes ticked away. When the timer finally reached 0, the video player activated automatically. The footage was grainy but clear enough to see a person bound to a chair in what looked like a basement or cellar. Their face was partially obscured by a hood, but I could tell they were conscious, struggling against their restraints. A figure moved in the background, just out of frame, only occasionally visible as a shadow or partial silhouette. For several minutes, nothing happened beyond the captive's continued struggles. Then text appeared at the bottom of the screen, stating that the required viewer threshold had been met and the session would proceed. Another message followed, thanking everyone for their participation and explaining that without sufficient witnesses, there would be no purpose to the demonstration. What happened next is something I've tried desperately to forget. The shadowy figure moved into frame, carrying what looked like ordinary workshop tools. The violence began slowly, methodically, with an almost clinical detachment. There was no dramatic monologue, no explanation or justification, just systematic escalating brutality. I wanted to close the browser, to pretend I'd never seen any of it, but a notification had appeared on screen, warning that any viewer who disconnected before the conclusion would automatically be added to the next session's notification list, with their own personal contacts as potential subjects. So I watched. For 47 minutes, I watched. When it finally ended, the stream didn't immediately disconnect. Instead, a message appeared thanking viewers for their compliance and promising another session in the near future. Then the browser tab closed itself automatically. I was physically sick afterward, vomiting until there was nothing left but bile and self-disgust. I spent the rest of the night in a state of panic, alternating between convinced I needed to go to the police and terrified of the consequences if I did. What if they thought I was somehow involved? What if reporting it put me on the radar of whoever was behind it? By morning, I'd convinced myself that it must have been an extremely realistic horror simulation, some underground shock site using excellent special effects to create the illusion of actual violence. The alternative was too horrific to contemplate. For a week, I checked the old email obsessively, both dreading and expecting another message with another countdown. None came, and I began to breathe easier. Perhaps it really had been a one-time thing, a bizarre digital experience that I could eventually file away as an unsettling memory. Then exactly 1 month later, I received a new email in my current, active email address, the one I use for work and everyday life. The subject line was the same string of numbers and letters from before. The body contained a new link, a new countdown set for exactly 24 hours, and an additional message informing me that my previous participation had been noted and that continued compliance was expected. Below that was a list of names and email addresses belonging to people I knew, colleagues, friends, family members. At the bottom was a simple instruction: choose one recipient for the next viewing invitation, or all would receive it automatically when the countdown expired. I've been caught in this cycle for 7 months now. Each time, I tell myself it will be the last. Each time, I'm given another impossible choice. I've tried using burner emails, VPNs, different devices. Nothing helps. They always find me. The only small mercy is that I've been able to select people I don't know personally from random email databases as the next recipients, though I'm consumed by guilt at the thought of passing this burden to strangers. I don't know who's behind it or what their purpose is. Is it some kind of psychological experiment, a depraved form of entertainment, an elaborate blackmail scheme waiting to be activated? All I know is that I've become an unwilling accomplice to something unspeakable with no clear way out. Sometimes I wonder if there's a pattern to who gets selected as victims in these streams, if there's some connection I'm missing that could help me break free of this nightmare, or if I'm just one link in a vast chain of trapped viewers, all of us silently watching horrors we can never speak of, all to protect ourselves and those we care about. If you ever receive an email with a countdown timer and an onion link, don't open it. Don't click anything. Delete the account entirely if you can. I don't know if that would have saved me, but I wish more than anything that I could go back to that day and close that old email account without ever opening that message. The most terrifying part isn't just what I've been forced to witness. It's knowing that somewhere out there, someone is watching me too, monitoring my compliance, perhaps even considering me for a future role beyond mere witness. Every email I receive now fills me with dread. Every countdown makes me wonder, when will it be my turn on the other side of the camera? There's a coffee shop across the street from this hotel in Preston, where I've been spending most of my afternoons, just sitting by the window watching people go about their ordinary lives. They look so normal, so unconcerned, and I find myself wondering if any of them have ever done something they can't take back, something that keeps them awake at 3 a.m, going over every decision they made. I used to be a video editor, corporate videos mostly, the sort of promotional content that companies use for their websites and training materials. Boring work, but steady, and it paid well enough for me to afford a decent flat in Manchester and the occasional holiday abroad. Then I lost that contract when the company moved their marketing department in-house, and I spent a few desperate months taking whatever freelance work I could find. That's how I ended up editing videos for people I never met. Content I should never have agreed to work on. Material that's now being used in ways I'm only just beginning to understand. I've been hiding here for nearly 3 weeks, moving hotels every few days, trying to work out if anyone knows I finally realized what those videos were actually for. The redundancy came at the worst possible time. I just renewed my lease for another year and had committed to a holiday in Greece that summer. I was 46 years old with nearly 20 years of editing experience, but the market was saturated with younger people who'd work for half what I charged and knew software I'd never bothered learning. I spent the first month applying for staff positions, then started lowering my standards to contract work, then freelance projects, then eventually anything that involved editing video for money. My savings were disappearing faster than I'd expected, and by the 3rd month I was genuinely worried about making rent. That's when I found the posting on a freelance website. Someone needed an experienced video editor for what they described as documentary projects requiring discretion and professional finishing. The rate was exceptional, about double what I'd been charging before my redundancy, and they needed someone who could start immediately on a series of ongoing projects. The client, who identified himself only as Mr. Harris, explained during our initial phone conversation that his projects involved sensitive subject matter that required absolute confidentiality. He represented a collective of documentary makers who operated in areas where mainstream media outlets were reluctant to venture. They needed editors who could work with raw footage and transform it into polished professional content without asking uncomfortable questions about how the footage was obtained or what it would ultimately be used for. I should have questioned what kind of documentary projects required such secretive arrangements. Should have wondered why legitimate filmmakers wouldn't just work with established editing houses. But Mr. Harris was offering steady work at rates I desperately needed, and I convinced myself that documentary makers often dealt with controversial subjects that required discretion from everyone involved. The first project arrived via encrypted file transfer, about 2 hours of raw footage showing the exterior of various residential properties. Mr. Harris wanted me to edit it into a 12-minute video, removing duplicate shots, stabilizing the camera work, and adding subtle background music that would give it a professional documentary feel. The footage was unremarkable, just static shots of houses from different angles taken at various times of day. I assumed it was B-roll for some property development documentary or neighborhood study. I edited it according to the brief, tightened the pacing, color-corrected the footage to make it look more professional, and delivered the finished video within the deadline. Mr. Harris was pleased with my work and immediately sent me another project. This one included footage of people going about their daily routines, leaving their homes, getting into cars, walking to local shops. Again, I edited it into a polished short documentary, assuming it was part of some anthropological study or social observation project. The work continued steadily over the following weeks. I'd receive raw footage of various subjects, properties, people, public spaces, and edit them into professional-looking short documentaries. The pay was excellent, the deadlines were reasonable, and I was grateful to have found steady work that utilized my skills. But I started noticing patterns in the footage that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Many of the videos focused on elderly people living alone, documenting their routines with obsessive detail. Others showed children playing in gardens or walking to school, filmed from positions that suggested the camera operator was concealing themselves. When I questioned Mr. Harris about the nature of these documentary projects, he explained they were studying vulnerable populations to better understand social isolation and community support needs. The footage was being used to develop interventions and support services for at-risk individuals. That explanation seemed plausible enough, though I was troubled by the covert nature of the filming. Surely legitimate social research would require informed consent from subjects, not secret surveillance. But Mr. Harris assured me the research ethics had been properly managed and my role was simply to edit the footage professionally, not to concern myself with research methodology. I accepted that explanation because I needed to believe the work was legitimate. The money was keeping me financially stable, and I'd developed a routine that felt almost like having a real job again. I couldn't afford to lose the income by asking uncomfortable questions that might cost me the contract. The projects became more specific and disturbing. Instead of general observation footage, I was editing videos that focused on particular individuals with obsessive detail. One project involved editing dozens of hours of footage showing a woman's daily routine. Leaving for work, returning home, grocery shopping, everything she did visible from public spaces. I edited it into a comprehensive profile video showing her predictable routine, her apparent vulnerabilities, her moments of inattention. The finished product looked like professional surveillance documentation, not a social research project. But Mr. Harris insisted this was part of studying patterns of behavior in women living alone, research that would inform safety recommendations. Another project focused on an elderly couple, documenting their movements, their visitors, their weekly routines. I edited it to highlight times when they were alone, security vulnerabilities in their property, even their apparent physical limitations that might make them easy targets for what exactly? I was starting to understand that these weren't documentary projects at all. The breakthrough came when I recognized a house in some footage Mr. Harris sent me. It was my neighbor's house in Manchester, filmed from the street and back alley with the same obsessive attention to detail I'd been seeing in other projects. The footage documented when my neighbor left for work, when she returned, which lights she turned on in the evening, even which windows she left open during warm weather. I realized immediately that I'd been editing surveillance footage for people planning to target specific individuals for burglary, harassment, or worse. The professional documentary style I'd been providing wasn't for legitimate research. It was making criminal intelligence gathering look polished and systematic for people who were planning serious crimes. I thought about all the other projects I'd edited over the past few months, all the individuals whose routines I documented with professional editing techniques that made surveillance footage look like carefully crafted observations. Each video I'd finished had probably enabled someone to be targeted by criminals who used my editing to study their victims before attacking them. But what made it unbearable was understanding that my professional skills had made the surveillance more effective. The raw footage Mr. Harris sent me was often shaky, poorly framed, amateurish. My editing transformed it into clear, professional documentation that would be far more useful for planning criminal activity. I'd taken rough intelligence gathering and turned it into comprehensive surveillance reports. I tried to refuse further projects, but Mr. Harris made it clear that walking away wasn't a simple option. I'd been working for months. Editing footage I must have understood wasn't for legitimate purposes. I'd accepted substantial payment for work that had facilitated criminal activity against dozens of people. If I caused problems now, he'd ensure the authorities understood my role in enabling what the surveillance had been used for. I was being threatened with my own complicity. The evidence of my editing work showed months of professional collaboration with people conducting criminal surveillance, even though I hadn't fully understood what I was doing initially. The pattern was clear enough that claiming ignorance wouldn't protect me from prosecution. That's when I started keeping copies of all the projects I'd edited, documenting the subjects and the detailed surveillance I'd helped create. I told myself I was preserving evidence, but really I was just trying to feel less guilty about the harm I'd enabled. The videos I'd edited weren't just being used for immediate criminal purposes. They were being shared and sold to multiple people through hidden internet marketplaces I discovered when Mr. Harris accidentally sent me a wrong link. My professionally edited surveillance videos were being treated as commodities, sold to anyone willing to pay for detailed intelligence about specific individuals. I found entire libraries of surveillance videos organized by location, demographic, and vulnerability type. Elderly people living alone, single parents, isolated individuals, all documented with the sort of professional editing I'd been providing. Each video had detailed descriptions of the subject's routines, vulnerabilities, and potential approaches for exploitation. Some videos I recognized from my own editing work. Others were clearly created by different editors, but followed similar professional standards. There was an entire industry of surveillance video production, with editors like me transforming raw footage into marketable intelligence products. But what disturbed me most was discovering how the videos were being used. They weren't just enabling individual burglaries or harassment campaigns. They were being used to coordinate systematic targeting of vulnerable people across the country. Groups would purchase multiple surveillance videos, then coordinate their activities to maximize the impact and minimize the risk of detection. One discussion thread focused on using surveillance videos to identify elderly people who could be targeted through distraction burglary techniques. Members shared the videos they'd purchased, discussing which subjects showed the most promising vulnerabilities and planning coordinated campaigns across different regions. Another section dealt with using surveillance videos to identify women living alone who could be targeted for stalking or worse. Users compared videos, rated subjects based on vulnerability, even discussed techniques for escalating from remote surveillance to direct contact. I was looking at evidence that my editing work had enabled systematic criminal targeting of vulnerable people, and that the professional quality I'd provided had made the surveillance more valuable and marketable. Every technical skill I'd applied, every professional flourish I'd added, it had all increased the commercial value of criminal intelligence about innocent people. The woman whose daily routine I'd edited into that comprehensive profile had subsequently been stalked for months by someone who'd purchased the video through the marketplace. The elderly couple I'd documented had been burgled 3 times, with the thieves showing intimate knowledge of their routines and vulnerabilities. My neighbour in Manchester had become a target after footage of her house appeared in the marketplace. I'd seen suspicious people watching her property, cars that didn't belong in the area parked outside her house at odd hours. She'd mentioned feeling unsafe, but couldn't explain why, had no evidence of actual threats, just a growing sense that something wasn't right. I knew exactly why she felt that way. Surveillance footage of her home had been professionally edited into a targeting package that documented her every vulnerability. And I was the one who'd done that editing, who'd transformed raw surveillance into the sort of polished product that maximized its criminal value. I tried contacting the police about what I'd discovered, but explaining my role without admitting extensive complicity proved impossible. I'd been editing surveillance footage for months, accepting substantial payment for work I should have recognized wasn't legitimate. The videos I'd created had facilitated serious crimes against real people. The officer I spoke to was professional but frank. Cooperation might be valuable for their investigation, but I shouldn't expect immunity from prosecution for my role in creating and distributing criminal surveillance materials. I'd been an active participant in an operation that had enabled serious harm to vulnerable people. I was advised to stop accepting editing work immediately and refuse further contact with Mr. Harris. But he'd already anticipated that possibility. I started receiving messages reminding me of our confidentiality agreement, emphasizing the documentation they had of my editing work, suggesting that creating problems would result in both legal consequences and more personal difficulties. The harassment escalated when I didn't respond. I received packages containing screenshots from the marketplace showing videos I'd edited, with annotations detailing crimes those videos had enabled. They were documenting my complicity systematically, building a case that would destroy my life if I tried to report their operations. Then I found my own address listed in the marketplace. Someone had created surveillance footage of my flat in Manchester, professionally edited in the same style I'd been using for months. My daily routine, my vulnerabilities, my security arrangements, all documented with the same obsessive detail I'd been applying to others. I was now a product in the marketplace I'd been supplying. My own life reduced to a surveillance video that could be purchased by anyone wanting to target me. The professional editing standards I'd established were being applied to my own surveillance, ensuring the footage would be maximally useful for anyone who bought it. That's when I left Manchester entirely, abandoning my flat and most of my possessions to hide in hotels across the north. I've been moving every few days, paying cash where possible, avoiding any digital traces that might help them track my location. But I know the surveillance videos I edited are still being sold and used. Other editors have probably been recruited to replace me. People who'll make the same rationalizations I did about just doing professional editing work, without responsibility for how the videos are used. The marketplace is probably still growing, still selling professional surveillance documentation to anyone willing to pay for intelligence about vulnerable targets. And somewhere in that marketplace, surveillance footage of me is being offered to people who've been told I know too much about their operations. I keep thinking about my neighbor, about the elderly couple who were burgled, about all the other people whose surveillance I edited into professional targeting packages. They went about their normal lives never knowing that someone had documented their every movement, that an editor had transformed that surveillance into marketable intelligence. The videos taught me that professional skills can be weaponized, that technical expertise becomes complicit when applied to criminal purposes, regardless of your intentions or understanding. That every color correction I made, every transition I added, every professional flourish I applied, it all increased the harm those videos could enable. And that once you've spent months editing surveillance footage you should have recognized wasn't legitimate, you become too compromised to report it without destroying your own life. The evidence of your professional collaboration is permanent, documented in videos that show your technical fingerprints on materials that enabled serious crimes. I suppose that's why I'm sitting in this Preston hotel watching normal people in coffee shops, rather than going back to police with all the evidence I preserved, because I know that evidence implicates me as thoroughly as it exposes the marketplace. And I'm not brave enough to face consequences for choices I made when I convinced myself I was just doing professional editing work. All I can do is hope that someone else will eventually expose these operations, that other editors will find the courage I lack to report what they're creating despite the personal cost, and hope that the people whose surveillance I edited so professionally managed to stay safe despite the targeting packages I helped create. Because the marketplace is still operating, still recruiting editors, still selling professional surveillance documentation to criminals who use it to target vulnerable people. And I helped establish the standards, helped prove that surveillance footage has more value when it's been professionally edited, helped create an industry that treats people's private lives as raw materials for criminal intelligence products. I just wish I could undo it all, could warn every person whose surveillance I edited, could take back every professional flourish I added to footage that was used to destroy people's sense of safety. But I can't, so I just keep moving between hotels and watching people in coffee shops, wondering if they've ever done something they can't take back, something that haunts them every day they continue living with the consequences of their choices. Here's something they don't tell you about rock bottom. When you're desperate enough, you'll trust anyone who offers you a way out. I was sitting in my bedsit in Preston, 3 months behind on rent, and seriously considering whether I had enough paracetamol in the bathroom cabinet, when I got that email about free therapy. No waiting lists, no GP referrals, just immediate help for people like me who'd lost their jobs and were struggling to keep their heads above water. I should have known that kind of generosity doesn't exist in the real world, especially not when it comes to mental health care in this country. The whole thing started when I was at my lowest point, after losing my job at the council offices in Preston. I'd been working in housing benefits for about 3 years, dealing with people who were often in desperate situations, and the stress had been building up without me really noticing. When the department restructured and my position was eliminated, I found myself on the other side of the benefit system I'd been administering. The redundancy payment kept me afloat for a few months, but job hunting while dealing with depression felt impossible. I'd wake up with good intentions about sending applications, then spend the day staring at my laptop screen feeling overwhelmed by the simplest tasks. My savings were running low, and I was starting to panic about paying rent. That's when I saw the email in my spam folder, which should have been my first warning sign. It was from something called the Community Mental Health Initiative, offering free counseling services to people experiencing work-related stress and depression. They claimed to be a new pilot program funded by local government grants, designed to provide immediate support to people who couldn't access NHS mental health services. The email was professional enough, with proper logos and contact information that looked legitimate. They were offering individual counseling sessions with qualified therapists, along with access to online resources and support groups for people dealing with employment issues and financial stress. I called the number provided and spoke to a receptionist who seemed knowledgeable about mental health services and government funding programs. She explained that they were specifically targeting people who had lost their jobs in the public sector. As research had shown, these individuals were particularly vulnerable to mental health crises. The receptionist scheduled me for an initial assessment with a counselor named Dr. Webb, who would evaluate my situation and recommend appropriate treatment options. The appointment was available within days rather than months, which seemed too good to be true, but was exactly what I needed. Dr. Webb's office was located in a modern business park outside Preston, in a building that housed various healthcare and professional services. The setup looked legitimate enough, with proper signage and a waiting area filled with mental health awareness materials and government health campaign posters. Dr. Webb herself seemed professional and qualified, asking appropriate questions about my mental health history, current symptoms, and life circumstances. She demonstrated genuine understanding of depression and anxiety, and her therapeutic approach felt competent and evidence-based. During the initial session, she explained that their program used innovative treatment methods that combined traditional counseling with digital therapy tools. Participants would attend weekly in-person sessions while also engaging with online resources designed to provide continuous support between appointments. The online component involved using specialized platforms that weren't available through mainstream internet channels. Dr. Webb explained that these experimental therapy tools required enhanced privacy and security measures to protect patient confidentiality and prevent unauthorized access to sensitive mental health data. She provided detailed instructions for accessing these digital therapy resources, including steps for downloading software that would connect me to private online communities and interactive therapy programs. The technology was presented as cutting-edge mental health treatment that was being piloted before wider NHS implementation. The weekly counseling sessions were genuinely helpful. Dr. Webb seemed skilled at cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, and I felt like I was making real progress in managing my depression and anxiety. The in-person therapy felt legitimate and professionally conducted. However, the online therapy components began to feel increasingly unusual. The private platforms I was accessing contained discussion groups and interactive content that seemed to go beyond typical mental health resources. Some of the online communities included people discussing extremely personal details about their psychological vulnerabilities, family relationships, and financial circumstances. The level of intimate information being shared seemed excessive for therapy support groups, and many participants appeared to be disclosing details that could be used to exploit or manipulate them. The interactive therapy programs also asked for unusually detailed personal information about my daily routines, social relationships, and decision-making processes. The assessments went far beyond what would be necessary for depression and anxiety treatment, probing into areas that seemed more relevant to psychological profiling than therapeutic intervention. When I mentioned feeling uncomfortable with the extensive personal disclosure required by the online platforms, Dr. Webb explained that modern digital therapy relied on comprehensive data collection to provide personalized treatment recommendations. The information I was providing would be analyzed by advanced algorithms to optimize my therapy experience. She also emphasized that all data was protected by strict confidentiality protocols and would only be used for legitimate therapeutic purposes. The detailed personal information was necessary to ensure that digital therapy tools could provide appropriate support for my specific psychological needs and life circumstances. Around the 6th week of treatment, Dr. Webb began incorporating exercises that involved researching and documenting information about other people in my social network. These assignments were presented as therapy techniques designed to help me understand relationship dynamics and improve my social support systems. I was asked to gather detailed information about friends and family members, including their mental health status, financial circumstances, and personal vulnerabilities. The therapeutic rationale was that understanding the complete context of my social relationships would help identify sources of stress and develop strategies for building healthier connections. These assignments felt intrusive and inappropriate for legitimate therapy work. When I expressed concerns about gathering personal information about friends and family without their knowledge or consent, Dr. Webb assured me that relationship analysis was a standard component of modern therapeutic practice. She explained that many mental health problems were rooted in dysfunctional social dynamics, and understanding these patterns required comprehensive assessment of all significant relationships. The information I gathered would only be used to develop better therapeutic strategies for my individual treatment. However, the specific types of information I was being asked to collect seemed designed for purposes beyond therapeutic analysis. I was documenting psychological vulnerabilities, financial pressures, and personal secrets that could be valuable for manipulation or exploitation, rather than mental health treatment. Some assignments involved using the online therapy platforms to connect with and gather information about people who weren't part of my existing social network. I was asked to engage with strangers in the digital therapy communities and document their personal circumstances and psychological states. When I questioned why therapy work involved systematic intelligence gathering about other people, Dr. Webb reminded me that I had been receiving valuable mental health treatment that would normally cost hundreds of pounds through private healthcare. The comprehensive nature of the treatment program required participants to engage fully with all therapeutic components. She also began demonstrating knowledge of my personal activities and circumstances that she couldn't have gathered through our therapy sessions alone. References to my daily routine, financial situation, and social interactions suggested that my participation in the online therapy platforms had provided comprehensive surveillance capabilities. I realized that the counseling program had been used to recruit me into systematic intelligence gathering operations disguised as mental health treatment. The therapy sessions had been legitimate enough to establish trust and dependency, while the online components had been used to gather detailed personal information about vulnerable people. The people participating in the digital therapy communities were probably being exploited in similar ways, with their mental health struggles being used to recruit them into activities that had nothing to do with legitimate therapeutic treatment. When I attempted to end my participation in the program, Dr. Webb pointed out that I had detailed knowledge of experimental therapy techniques and access to sensitive information about other participants. My involvement in the program had created ongoing responsibilities that couldn't simply be terminated. She also suggested that ending treatment abruptly could be harmful to my mental health progress, particularly given my history of depression and current unemployment stress. The therapeutic relationship we had developed was important for my psychological stability and shouldn't be disrupted without careful consideration. The surveillance of my personal activities became more obvious after I tried to withdraw from the program. The monitoring capabilities that had been established through the online therapy platforms continued to track my communications and activities even after I stopped participating in the digital components. I tried reporting my concerns to mental health regulatory authorities, but discovered that explaining the situation was extremely difficult. The counseling sessions had been professionally conducted. The online therapy could be justified as innovative treatment methods, and the personal information gathering could be explained as necessary therapeutic assessment. Dr. Webb's organization continued to contact me for several months after I stopped attending sessions, offering additional mental health services and occasionally sending references to my personal activities to remind me that their monitoring capabilities remained active. I never determined who was actually directing the counseling program or what they were using the detailed personal intelligence for. The systematic exploitation of people's mental health vulnerabilities, combined with sophisticated surveillance techniques disguised as therapy tools, suggested an organization capable of extensive manipulation and control. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for exploiting people's mental health needs to recruit unwitting participants in intelligence-gathering operations. They understood how to use legitimate therapeutic relationships to establish trust and dependency, while using digital therapy platforms to gather comprehensive personal information about vulnerable individuals. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my genuine need for mental health support had been transformed into participation in systematic exploitation of other people struggling with similar problems. The counseling program had been designed to identify and recruit people whose psychological vulnerabilities could be leveraged for criminal purposes. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar mental health organizations, offering innovative therapy programs that combine traditional counseling with experimental digital treatment methods. The services they describe always offer immediate access without waiting lists, always involve online components that require specialized software, and always emphasize the need for comprehensive personal disclosure. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other people struggling with mental health issues have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are receiving legitimate therapeutic support, while actually participating in intelligence-gathering operations that exploit their psychological vulnerabilities for criminal purposes. About 2 years ago, when things weren't going particularly well in my life, someone suggested finding an online support group. It seemed like reasonable advice at the time, a way to connect with people dealing with similar issues, get some perspective from others who'd been through what I was going through. Nothing dramatic or unusual, just the kind of thing people do nowadays when they need help and don't quite know where else to turn. The group I eventually found seemed perfect, welcoming, supportive, full of people who understood exactly what I was dealing with. It felt genuine, like I'd stumbled across something really valuable during a difficult period. Looking back now, I suppose there were small things that should have made me question it. But when you're vulnerable and someone's offering understanding, you don't tend to look too closely at the details. And that's the problem, really, because it wasn't a support group at all. It was a data collection operation targeting vulnerable people, and everything I shared there over 3 months, my fears, my routines, my personal struggles, was compiled into a profile that's been sold more times than I can count to people who see emotional vulnerability as something worth exploiting. I'm a pharmacy assistant working in Plymouth, been doing it for around 9 years now. It's steady work, dealing with prescriptions and customer queries. Nothing particularly stressful under normal circumstances. But 2 years ago, I went through a difficult divorce that left me struggling with anxiety and insomnia. I'd wake at 3 a.m. with my mind racing, unable to settle, feeling isolated and overwhelmed by changes in my life I hadn't chosen and couldn't control. My GP prescribed some medication for the anxiety and suggested counseling, which helped to a degree. But what I really wanted was to talk to people who'd been through similar experiences, who understood the specific challenges of rebuilding life after a marriage ends. Professional therapy felt formal and clinical. I wanted something more personal, more immediate, the kind of peer support that comes from shared experience rather than professional expertise. I found the group through a recommendation on a women's health website. It was called Moving Forward Together, described as a safe space for women recovering from relationship breakdowns. The website looked professional and compassionate, with testimonials from members who'd found comfort and practical advice through the community. There was a simple registration process requiring an email address and some basic information about your situation. Then you'd receive login details to access the private discussion area. I registered one evening when I couldn't sleep, filled out a form explaining I was recovering from divorce and struggling with anxiety and insomnia. Within hours, I received a welcome email with instructions for accessing the group's discussion platform. It was set up like a private social network, with message boards for different topics, member profiles, and direct messaging capabilities. The group seemed genuinely supportive. There were around 50 active members, all women apparently going through or recovering from relationship difficulties. They shared stories about their experiences, offered advice about practical matters like finances and childcare arrangements, provided emotional support during difficult moments. The tone was warm and understanding, exactly the kind of community I'd been hoping to find. I started participating regularly, posting about my struggles with anxiety and sleep, responding to others who were dealing with similar issues. People were kind and empathetic, sharing their own experiences and suggesting things that had helped them. One woman recommended specific relaxation techniques that she'd found useful. Another suggested herbal remedies that had helped her sleep. A third shared details about how she'd managed the financial challenges of living alone after years of shared expenses. The group felt safe enough that I found myself sharing quite personal information, details about my daily routine and how anxiety was affecting my work, specific fears about being alone that made me hypervigilant about home security, information about my financial situation and concerns about managing on a single income. The kind of vulnerable honesty that comes from feeling understood by people in similar circumstances. One aspect of the group that seemed particularly helpful was a feature called Accountability Partners. You could request to be matched with another member for more private one-to-one support, someone you'd check in with regularly to share progress and challenges. I was matched with a woman who called herself Sarah, who'd apparently been through a difficult divorce 3 years earlier and was now helping newer members navigate their own recovery. Sarah and I messaged frequently, sometimes daily. She asked detailed questions about my situation, always framing them as genuine interest in helping me work through challenges. What specific aspects of living alone made me most anxious? What times of day did I feel most vulnerable? Did I have family nearby who could provide support? What were my work hours like? And how did that affect my ability to manage household responsibilities alone? I answered all her questions honestly, grateful for someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding my situation. I told her about my morning routine and how I'd struggled to get motivated to leave for work, about coming home to an empty house in the evenings and feeling the absence of another person more acutely then, about lying awake at night, worrying about things I'd never worried about when I wasn't living alone, unusual sounds outside, whether doors and windows were properly secured, whether anyone knew I was by myself. Sarah would respond with understanding and practical advice. She'd share similar experiences from her own recovery, suggest specific strategies for managing anxiety, ask follow-up questions that showed she was really listening and thinking about my situation. It felt like genuine friendship developing, the kind of connection that helps you feel less alone during difficult times. After about 3 months of active participation in the group, I started feeling better. The anxiety was more manageable, I was sleeping more consistently, and life as a single person was becoming normal rather than frightening. I participated less frequently in the group discussions, not because I was unhappy with the community, but because I simply needed it less. I check in occasionally, but mostly I was moving forward with my life, which was the entire point. Then, about 6 months after I'd largely stopped participating, I received an email from someone claiming to be a journalist investigating online support groups. She explained that she'd found evidence that moving forward together wasn't what it appeared to be, and she was trying to contact former members to warn them about what their personal information might have been used for. I was skeptical at first, thinking it might be spam or some kind of scam, but the journalist provided specific details about the group that convinced me she was legitimate. She explained that moving forward together was operated by people who specialized in gathering detailed personal information from vulnerable individuals, information that could be used for various forms of exploitation, including targeted fraud, stalking, and burglary. She discovered this whilst investigating a series of burglaries targeting single women, all of whom had at some point participated in online support groups for relationship recovery. The pattern had been subtle enough that police hadn't initially connected the cases, but the journalist had noticed similarities in how the victims had been selected and the timing of when they were targeted. The journalist had managed to gain access to back-end systems used by the people running Moving Forward Together, and what she found was disturbing. The group wasn't a genuine support community. It was a sophisticated information-gathering operation designed to extract detailed personal information from emotionally vulnerable women under the guise of peer support and friendship. Every post made in the group was being analyzed and compiled into individual member profiles. The direct messages, the accountability partnerships, the private conversations where members shared their most vulnerable moments, all of it was being recorded and organized into comprehensive dossiers about each participant's life, fears, routines, and circumstances. My profile included everything I'd shared over those 3 months: my work schedule at the pharmacy and typical routines, my home address, which I'd mentioned in context of discussing my neighborhood and feeling isolated there, detailed information about my anxiety triggers and specific fears about living alone, notes about my financial situation and what valuables I owned, even analysis of my sleeping patterns and what times I was most likely to be home versus away. But the profile also included information I'd never shared directly analysis based on what I'd written, inferences about my psychology and behavior, assessments of my vulnerability to different types of exploitation. Notes indicating I was particularly susceptible to authority figures and likely to comply with demands from people presenting themselves as official or helpful. Observations about my tendency to trust people who seem understanding and supportive. The journalist showed me screenshots of the dark web marketplace where these profiles were being sold. It was organized like a database of vulnerable targets, searchable by location, living situation, specific vulnerabilities, and types of exploitable information available. My profile was listed under single women in the Plymouth area with documented anxiety and security concerns. The listing emphasized the quality and detail of information available. It highlighted that I'd willingly shared intimate details about my fears and routines, that I'd been open about my financial situation and possessions, that I'd documented specific times when I was home alone and feeling most vulnerable. All of this was presented as valuable intelligence for anyone interested in targeting me for fraud, burglary, stalking, or other forms of exploitation. The purchase history showed my profile had been bought by 8 different accounts over the past 18 months. 8 separate people or organizations had paid money for comprehensive information about my personal life, my vulnerabilities, my routines, my fears. The marketplace didn't reveal buyer identities, but the journalist had been working with police to try to trace some transactions and identify who was purchasing these profiles. What made it particularly insidious was how the information had been gathered. I hadn't been tricked into sharing personal details through obvious phishing or fraud. I'd voluntarily provided everything, believing I was participating in a genuine support community, trusting that my vulnerability would be met with compassion rather than exploitation. The entire operation was built on weaponizing the instinct to seek help and connection during difficult times. The journalist had identified around 200 women whose profiles were being sold through the same marketplace, all of them having participated in various online support groups operated by the same organization. Groups for relationship recovery, bereavement support, health anxiety, financial stress. Any community where people were likely to share detailed personal information while seeking help and understanding. Several women whose profiles had been purchased had subsequently been victims of crimes. Burglaries timed to occur when they were reliably away from home. Sophisticated fraud attempts targeting their specific financial vulnerabilities. Stalking by individuals who'd used the profiles to learn their routines and locations. The journalist had documented around 15 cases where profile purchases correlated clearly with subsequent victimization. I contacted the police after speaking with the journalist. They were already investigating the operation based on information she'd provided, and they took detailed statements from me about my participation in the group and what I'd shared. They explained that prosecuting these cases was complicated because the information had been voluntarily provided, even though the context was deceptive. The act of compiling and selling the information might be illegal, but proving that members had been deliberately deceived required demonstrating the group's true purpose. A detective showed me more details about how the operation worked. The people running it had created dozens of different support groups covering various life challenges. Each group appeared independent, with different branding and website designs, but they were all operated by the same organization, collecting information for the same marketplace. The accountability partnership feature was particularly calculated, pairing vulnerable members with supposed peers who were actually employees, trained to extract specific types of information through empathetic conversation. Sarah, my accountability partner, wasn't a real member who'd recovered from divorce. She was someone employed to build trust with me and systematically gathered details about my life that could be valuable to potential buyers. The detective walked me through evidence they'd gathered about Sarah specifically. Her real name was something else entirely, and she'd been matched with around 40 different women across various support groups, always playing the role of recovered peer offering help to newer members. She had scripts for different scenarios, guidelines for what information to prioritize, training in how to build trust and encourage vulnerable disclosure. Learning that those months of what felt like genuine friendship had been calculated, manipulation was devastating in a way that's difficult to articulate. Sarah's empathy had been performance, her understanding had been strategic, and every vulnerable thing I'd shared with her had been recorded and packaged for sale to strangers who viewed my emotional struggles as exploitable weaknesses. The police investigation eventually led to arrests of several people involved in operating the support groups and marketplace. But the profiles themselves had already been widely distributed. My information, along with hundreds of other women's detailed personal disclosures, existed in private collections of people who downloaded them before law enforcement shut down the marketplace. I had to make significant changes to my life to feel even marginally safe after discovering this. I moved to a different area within Plymouth, stopped using my previous routines, closed down most of my social media presence. I'm hypervigilant about what information I share online now, even in contexts that seem genuinely helpful and supportive. The experience has made me deeply suspicious of online communities and reluctant to seek help even when I need it. What haunts me most is thinking about the 8 unknown buyers who purchased my profile. Who were they? Why were they interested in detailed information about me specifically? What did they plan to do with knowledge of my fears and routines? The journalist and police identified connections to some crimes, but most buyers remained untraced, their intentions unknown, their continued interest in my information impossible to assess. I also think about the other women whose profiles were sold through that marketplace. How many of them still don't know what happened, still believe they participated in genuine support groups, still trust that their vulnerable disclosures were held in confidence by compassionate peers? The journalist contacted everyone she could identify, but there were gaps in member information, and many women who'd used pseudonyms that couldn't be traced to real identities. The psychological impact has been harder to manage than the practical security measures. I struggle to trust people now, particularly when they seem understanding or supportive. I question whether kindness is genuine or calculated, whether people asking about my well-being actually care, or are gathering information for purposes I don't understand. The suspicion affects my relationships and makes it difficult to accept help even from people who genuinely want to provide it. I joined that support group looking for help during a difficult time in my life. I shared my fears, my struggles, my vulnerable moments, believing I was participating in a community of mutual support and understanding. Instead, I was providing detailed intelligence that was compiled, analyzed, and sold to people who viewed my emotional vulnerability as exploitable weakness. That's what I think about now when I see online support groups advertised. Not whether they're genuinely helpful or moderated by caring people, but whether they're information gathering operations targeting vulnerable individuals. Whether the supportive responses and empathetic questions are genuine or strategic, designed to extract valuable personal details that can be packaged and sold to buyers with malicious intent. The profiles exist. The violation is permanent. And somewhere, 8 different people or organizations possess comprehensive information about my life during my most vulnerable period. Information I shared voluntarily, believing I was seeking help from people who understood my struggles. That knowledge has changed how I navigate the world, making me cautious where I used to be trusting, suspicious where I used to be open, isolated where I used to seek connection. I sought help when I was struggling, and that decision to reach out left me permanently compromised. My vulnerability was weaponized, my trust was exploited, and my most private struggles were converted into a product sold to strangers whose interest in me is anything but compassionate. That's the price I paid for trying to find support during a difficult time, and it's a price I'll be paying for the rest of my life. I wish I'd never listened to my dentist's recommendation about finding a good therapist. Dr. Matthews meant well when he suggested I might benefit from talking to someone about my anxiety, especially after I'd mentioned the panic attacks that were making it difficult to sit through dental procedures. He even gave me a specific name, Sarah Chen, a private counselor who apparently specialized in treating medical phobias and had excellent reviews from former patients. What he didn't mention was how those reviews had been collected, or why Dr. Chen's practice operated exclusively through referrals from other medical professionals. I should have been more suspicious when I couldn't find her listed with any of the usual professional bodies, or when her clinic address turned out to be a residential flat in a converted Victorian house in Oxford. But I was desperate enough for help that I overlooked the irregularities, especially when she offered evening appointments that fitted around my work schedule as a primary school teaching assistant. The first session seemed perfectly legitimate. Dr. Chen was professional and knowledgeable, asking appropriate questions about my medical history and anxiety symptoms. Her consulting room was well appointed, with the sort of comfortable chairs and neutral decor you'd expect from a private practice. She explained that her approach focused on gradual exposure therapy, combined with cognitive behavioral techniques, which sounded reasonable enough. What struck me as slightly odd was her interest in my daily routine and living situation. She spent considerable time asking about my home environment, work relationships, and social connections. When I mentioned that I lived alone in a rented cottage on the outskirts of Whitney, she made detailed notes and asked follow-up questions about my neighbors, security arrangements, and weekly schedule. I assumed this was standard practice for building a comprehensive treatment plan, but looking back, the questions were more invasive than therapeutic. She wanted to know which days I worked late, whether I had family nearby, how often I traveled overnight, the sort of information that would help someone understand my vulnerabilities rather than my psychological needs. After 3 sessions, Dr. Chen suggested that I might benefit from a more intensive treatment approach. She explained that traditional therapy could only achieve limited results within the constraints of weekly hour-long appointments, and that some patients responded better to immersive techniques that addressed anxiety triggers in more realistic settings. She offered to arrange what she called a residential assessment weekend at a specialized facility that worked with her practice. The program would involve controlled exposure to medical environments while providing intensive support and monitoring. It sounded expensive, but she assured me that the cost would be covered through a research grant she'd received for treating specific types of medical phobia. I should have researched the facility she mentioned, or asked for more details about the research program, but I was so relieved to find treatment that might actually help that I agreed immediately. Dr. Chen scheduled the assessment for the following weekend and promised to send me preparation materials and location details. The information pack arrived 3 days later, delivered by hand rather than through the post. It contained a detailed schedule for the weekend program, consent forms for various treatment procedures, and directions to a private clinic located in an isolated farmhouse near Chipping Norton. Reading through the materials more carefully, I noticed several concerning details that I'd missed during our conversation. The consent forms included permission for video recording of all treatment sessions, supposedly for research purposes. There were also clauses allowing for the use of sedative medications and physical restraint procedures if patients became distressed during exposure therapy. Most troubling was a section requiring participants to surrender all personal belongings, including mobile phones and identification documents, for the duration of the program. This was explained as necessary to prevent external distractions from interfering with the therapeutic process, but it meant spending an entire weekend completely cut off from the outside world. I called Dr. Chen's office to discuss my concerns, but her receptionist explained that she was attending a conference and wouldn't be available until after the weekend. If I wanted to participate in the current research cycle, I needed to confirm my attendance by Friday afternoon. The pressure to make an immediate decision felt manipulative, but I was torn between suspicion and desperation. The panic attacks had been getting worse, affecting my ability to work and maintain normal relationships. If there was a chance this program could help, was I being paranoid to worry about administrative irregularities? I spent Thursday evening researching the facility address online, trying to find information about the clinic and its treatment programs. What I discovered was more disturbing than I'd expected. The property was registered as a private residence with no planning permission for commercial medical use. Local council records showed no registered business operating from that address, and there were no reviews or references to any clinic in the area. More concerning were several police reports from the past year involving the property. Neighbors had complained about unusual activity during weekend periods, multiple cars arriving late at night, unusual sounds, and what appeared to be security personnel patrolling the grounds. One report mentioned a woman who had approached a nearby farmhouse claiming to be lost and asking to use a phone. She appeared distressed and mentioned being taken to the property for medical treatment, but when police investigated, they found no evidence of any current activity at the clinic. The woman had provided a name and address that turned out to be false, and she disappeared before officers could conduct a follow-up interview. I tried calling Dr. Chen's office again, but the number was no longer in service. When I drove to her clinic address the next morning, I found the flat completely empty with a "To Let" sign in the window. Dr. Chen had vanished completely, along with all evidence that her practice had ever existed. That's when I started looking into how I'd found her in the first place, and what I discovered led me into the darkest corners of the internet. Dr. Matthews claimed to have no record of recommending any therapist to me, despite my clear memory of our conversation. When I pressed him for details, he seemed genuinely confused and suggested I might have misremembered our discussion about anxiety management. But I knew what I'd heard, and I knew Dr. Chen had mentioned being referred specifically by dental practices in the area. Someone was running an operation that involved infiltrating medical referral networks and targeting vulnerable patients for unknown purposes. I spent the weekend researching similar cases online, following leads through various medical community boards and patient support groups. What I found were scattered reports of people who'd been referred to private practitioners who subsequently disappeared, leaving patients with unanswered questions and appointments that led nowhere. The pattern was always the same: referrals from legitimate medical professionals who later denied making any recommendations, followed by intensive assessment procedures that required patients to isolate themselves completely from external contact. None of the patients who'd attended these residential programs had posted follow-up reviews or updates about their treatment outcomes. Following these research threads led me deeper into online communities where people shared information about medical fraud and patient exploitation. Eventually, I found myself accessing hidden forums that existed beyond normal internet searches. The dark web contained entire sections dedicated to what insiders called patient acquisition services. The platforms I discovered were sophisticated marketplaces where buyers could commission the recruitment of specific types of medical patients. The services offered were presented in clinical language, but the underlying purpose was unmistakable. They were trafficking vulnerable people who sought legitimate medical help. Clients could specify their requirements in detail: age ranges, medical conditions, living situations, psychological profiles. The acquisition teams would then infiltrate appropriate medical networks, pose as legitimate practitioners, and identify suitable targets for recruitment. Dr. Chen wasn't a real therapist. She was part of a systematic operation that identified isolated, vulnerable patients and delivered them to clients who paid substantial sums for access to people with specific characteristics. The residential assessment weekends weren't treatment programs. They were handover procedures where acquired patients were transferred to buyers who had commissioned their recruitment. I found discussion threads where clients shared their experiences with different acquisition services, rating them based on the quality of their targeting and the effectiveness of their recruitment methods. The language was casual and commercial, discussing human beings as if they were products being purchased for specific purposes. Some clients appeared to be running unauthorized medical experiments, seeking patients with particular conditions for research that couldn't be conducted through legitimate channels. Others seemed to have psychological motivations that were harder to categorize, but far more disturbing. There were conversations about clients who enjoyed the process of gradually breaking down their acquired subject's sense of reality, using medical authority and isolation to create complete psychological dependence. The patients were kept in controlled environments where their previous lives were systematically erased, replaced with artificial relationships and manufactured realities. What made it worse was the realization that many patients never understood what had happened to them. The acquisition process was designed to feel legitimate until the final handover, when it was too late to escape or seek help. By then, they were completely isolated and dependent on their captors for basic survival. I thought about the consent forms I'd nearly signed, authorizing sedation and restraint procedures, about the requirement to surrender all personal belongings and identification, about spending a weekend in a remote location with no external contact, trusting people whose identities and qualifications were entirely fabricated. If I'd attended that residential assessment, I would have disappeared completely. My colleagues would have assumed I'd left my job without notice. My landlord would have thought I'd abandoned my tenancy, and my few casual friends would have gradually forgotten about me. There would have been no investigation because there would have been no obvious crime. Just another isolated person who'd chosen to start a new life elsewhere without maintaining previous relationships. The discussion forums contained detailed breakdowns of successful acquisition operations, including patient profiles and outcome summaries. Reading through these accounts, I recognized several names from missing person appeals I'd seen over the past year. Young adults with medical conditions, mental health issues, or social isolation problems. People who'd been seeking legitimate help and had instead been targeted by acquisition teams that identified them as suitable products for specific clients. The efficiency of the operation was terrifying. They had infiltrated medical referral networks across multiple cities, building comprehensive databases of potential targets and their psychological vulnerabilities. When clients commissioned specific acquisitions, the teams could identify and recruit suitable patients within weeks. Dr. Chen had been conducting market research during our sessions, assessing my suitability for particular client requirements. The questions about my living situation and social connections weren't therapeutic. They were determining how easily I could be made to disappear without investigation. But what disturbed me most was discovering how close I'd come to being successfully acquired. The residential assessment had been scheduled for the weekend before I'd started asking questions, and my name appeared in several client discussion threads as a confirmed delivery for a buyer who specialized in collecting patients with specific anxiety disorders. Someone had already paid for me. The acquisition team had spent weeks building my trust and preparing for handover when my last-minute research had disrupted their timeline. But they hadn't cancelled the operation. They'd simply postponed it while they regrouped and planned alternative approaches. My name was still listed in their active acquisition database, marked as a priority target for re-engagement. I've been watching for signs of renewed contact ever since, but the approaches have become more subtle. Medical professionals I've never met have called to follow up on appointments I never made. Healthcare providers have sent appointment reminders for services I never requested. Prescription medications have been delivered to my address for conditions I don't have. They're rebuilding their profile of me through different channels, gathering updated information about my daily routine and current vulnerabilities. Preparing for another acquisition attempt that will be hard to detect and more difficult to escape. The most disturbing realization is that legitimate medical professionals might be unknowingly facilitating these operations. The acquisition teams are sophisticated enough to infiltrate real healthcare systems, using genuine medical credentials to make their recruitment approaches appear authentic. Dr. Matthews probably did recommend Dr. Chen, but his patient management system had been compromised to insert false referral records. The recommendation felt legitimate because it was processed through legitimate channels that had been corrupted without his knowledge. This means the entire healthcare system could be compromised, with acquisition teams using trusted medical networks to identify and recruit vulnerable patients for clients who remain completely anonymous. I've tried reporting what I've discovered to various authorities, but explaining dark web marketplaces and patient acquisition services sounds like paranoid fantasy when described to people who haven't seen the evidence themselves. The platforms I accessed have since changed their addresses and access requirements, making verification impossible. All I can do is remain vigilant for signs of renewed contact and hope that sharing this account might help other people recognize similar approaches before it's too late. But I know they haven't given up on acquiring me. The client who commissioned my recruitment has paid significant money for someone with my specific profile, and these operations don't abandon expensive investments easily. They're still out there, watching my medical records and monitoring my healthcare contacts, waiting for the right opportunity to complete the acquisition they've already paid for. The next time a medical professional recommends a specialist I've never heard of, or when I receive unexpected healthcare correspondence, I'll know what it really means. I referred a patient to someone I thought was a legitimate specialist, and 6 months later I discovered what those appointments had actually involved. The guilt of that still wakes me up most nights, knowing I sent someone into danger whilst believing I was helping them. I'm a GP working at a surgery in Cardiff, been there for around 12 years now. It's the sort of practice where you get to know your patients properly, see the same families for years, watch children grow up and elderly patients gradually decline. I'd always taken pride in that continuity of care, in being someone people could trust with their health concerns. Last spring, a pharmaceutical rep named Helen started visiting the surgery. Nothing unusual about that. Drug companies send representatives to practices all the time, promoting their products and leaving samples. Helen was professional and knowledgeable, representing a company I'd vaguely heard of but didn't know much about. She focused mainly on pain management medications and treatments for chronic conditions. Over several months, Helen became a regular presence at the surgery. She'd drop by every few weeks, always polite and never pushy, just making herself available if any of us wanted to discuss her company's products. She brought lunch for the staff occasionally, remembered people's birthdays, the sort of relationship building that pharmaceutical reps typically engage in. During one of her visits, Helen mentioned that her company had started offering a specialized pain management program for patients with complex chronic conditions. It was being piloted in select areas, combining medication with physiotherapy and psychological support. She explained that they were looking for general practitioner practices willing to refer suitable patients for assessment. The program sounded legitimate enough. Helen provided detailed literature about it, including information about the specialists involved and the treatment protocols they used. She emphasized that it was completely free for patients, funded by her company as part of a research initiative into integrated pain management approaches. All I needed to do was identify patients who might benefit and provide their details for the assessment team to contact them. I had several patients who fit the criteria perfectly. People with chronic back pain, fibromyalgia, arthritis that wasn't responding well to conventional treatments. These were individuals I'd been treating for years, watching them struggle with pain that significantly impacted their quality of life. The idea that they could access specialized support at no cost seemed like an opportunity I couldn't ignore. I discussed the program with 3 of my patients, all middle-aged women dealing with different chronic pain conditions. I explained what Helen had told me about the integrated approach and the research component. All 3 agreed to be referred, grateful for the chance to try something that might help where other treatments had failed. Helen collected their details and contact information. She assured me the assessment team would be in touch with them within a fortnight to arrange initial consultations. She mentioned that the appointments would take place at a private clinic in Bristol, about an hour's drive from Cardiff, and that transport could be arranged if needed. Over the next few months, I'd check in with those 3 patients during their regular appointments. They all mentioned they'd been contacted and had attended initial assessments. The reports seemed positive but vague. They'd mentioned seeing specialists and undergoing various examinations, but when I asked for specifics, they'd say they'd been asked not to discuss the details until the program was complete. Something about maintaining research integrity. That should have concerned me more than it did. The vagueness of their descriptions, the emphasis on confidentiality, the fact that I never received any clinical updates from the specialists supposedly managing their care. But I was busy. The patients seemed reasonably satisfied with the attention they were receiving, and I had no concrete reason to question what Helen had told me. It was one of my colleagues who first raised doubts. Dr. Patel mentioned during a staff meeting that she'd tried to research Helen's pharmaceutical company and couldn't find much information about them online. The company had a basic website but no significant presence, no press releases about their research programs, nothing that suggested they were legitimate players in the pharmaceutical industry. That conversation prompted me to do my own research. I searched for the pain management program Helen had described and found absolutely nothing. No published studies, no mentions in medical journals, no references to the Bristol clinic where my patients were supposedly being treated. I tried searching for the specialists Helen had named in her literature, and while some of them existed, none were actually affiliated with the company or program she'd described. I called Helen's mobile number, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried the company's main number from their website, and it rang endlessly without being answered. I emailed the addresses Helen had provided, and all my messages bounced back as undeliverable. That's when I started to panic. I'd referred 3 of my patients to what was apparently a fake medical program, providing their personal details and medical information to someone I now realized I knew almost nothing about. I had no idea where they had actually been going for those appointments or who they'd been seeing. I contacted all 3 patients immediately, asking them to come in for urgent appointments. 2 of them attended within days. The third, a woman named Margaret, who'd been dealing with chronic back pain for years, didn't respond to my calls or messages. When I tried her emergency contact, her daughter told me Margaret had moved away suddenly about a month earlier and hadn't left a forwarding address. The 2 patients who did come in were reluctant to discuss the program at first. They'd been told that breaking confidentiality before the research concluded would disqualify them from receiving the full treatment benefits. But when I explained my concerns about the program's legitimacy, they started sharing details that made my stomach turn. The appointments hadn't taken place at a medical clinic. They'd been conducted at a residential property in Bristol, a large house that had been fitted out to look clinical, but wasn't a registered medical facility. The so-called specialists weren't doctors or physiotherapists. The examinations had been intrusive and humiliating, involving extensive photography and video recording that the patients were told was necessary for medical documentation. They'd been given medications during these sessions, pills and injections that supposedly targeted their pain conditions, but that neither patient could identify. The medications made them drowsy and compliant, which is why they couldn't recall all the details of what happened during their appointments. What they did remember suggested the examinations went far beyond anything medically necessary or appropriate. Both women described feeling violated, but not understanding why at the time. The people conducting the examinations had used proper medical terminology and maintained a clinical atmosphere, which made it difficult to recognize that what was happening was actually abuse disguised as treatment. They'd trusted the program because their GP had referred them to it, never imagining I'd send them somewhere dangerous. I reported everything to the police and the General Medical Council immediately. The police investigation uncovered that Helen wasn't a pharmaceutical rep at all. She was part of a group that targeted medical practices, posing as legitimate company representatives to gain access to patient information and identify vulnerable individuals who could be exploited. The house in Bristol, where the appointments had taken place, was owned by someone with no medical qualifications whatsoever. The property had been deliberately set up to resemble a clinical environment, complete with examination tables, medical equipment, and official-looking documentation. Everything designed to maintain the illusion of legitimacy, whilst actual abuse was taking place. The police found recording equipment throughout the house. Everything that happened during those appointments had been filmed from multiple angles, apparently for distribution, rather than any medical purpose. They discovered files containing videos of dozens of women, not just my 3 patients, but many others who'd been referred by different doctors across Wales and the southwest of England. The recordings had been uploaded to a website on the dark web, marketed as genuine medical examinations conducted without the patient's knowledge or consent. The site charged for access to different categories of content, with prices varying based on the type of examination and the patient's appearance. My patients' videos were among hundreds available for viewing and download. What made it particularly disturbing was how the scheme exploited the trust inherent in medical relationships. The fake programs specifically targeted patients with chronic pain conditions because those individuals were often desperate for help and willing to try treatments they might otherwise question. They trusted their doctor's referrals implicitly, never imagining a general practitioner would unknowingly direct them into such a situation. The investigation revealed that Helen and her associates had been operating this scheme for over 2 years, targeting multiple GP practices across the region. They'd refined their approach over time, learning which types of doctors were most likely to make referrals without extensive verification. Busy practices with high patient loads were ideal targets because doctors didn't have time to thoroughly investigate every program or specialist they encountered. I had to contact every patient I'd ever discussed the program with, even those who hadn't been referred, to ensure they hadn't been approached independently by Helen's group. I had to explain to the families of those who had been referred what their loved ones had actually experienced during those appointments. The conversations were devastating, watching people realize that medical authority had been used to facilitate abuse. The 2 patients who'd attended my urgent appointments both reported significant trauma from the experience. They'd sought medical help for legitimate pain conditions and ended up being violated and filmed without their knowledge. The medications they'd been given had made it difficult to resist or fully comprehend what was happening, which added another layer of violation to the whole experience. Margaret, the patient who disappeared, was eventually located living in a hostel in Birmingham. She'd left Cardiff suddenly after realizing something was wrong with the program and feeling too ashamed to explain to anyone what had happened. She was the patient who'd attended the most appointments, around 8 or 9 over 4 months, and she carried the most trauma from the experience. She trusted me completely when I referred her, never questioning that the program might be anything other than what I'd described. The recordings of my patients were removed from that specific website, but the police confirmed they'd been downloaded numerous times before the site was shut down. Those videos existed somewhere in private collections, possibly redistributed through other platforms that law enforcement couldn't access or monitor. The violation was permanent, irreversible, continuing to exist in spaces the victims would never be able to control. Helen and 3 others involved in the scheme were eventually arrested and prosecuted. The sentences seemed inadequate given the scale of what they'd done, the number of women they'd exploited, the systematic way they'd corrupted medical trust to facilitate abuse. Helen received 5 years, serving probably half that before release. The others received similar or lighter sentences. The professional consequences for me were severe. I was formally reprimanded by the GMC for failing to adequately verify the program before making referrals. My defense that I'd been deliberately deceived by sophisticated criminals was noted, but didn't eliminate my responsibility to protect my patients from harm. Several of the affected patients filed complaints, which I couldn't defend against because ultimately I had failed them. My reputation in the medical community was damaged beyond repair. Other GPs knew about what happened, knew that my lack of due diligence had resulted in patients being abused. Pharmaceutical reps stopped visiting because I'd become too cautious, questioning everything to the point of being unable to make normal clinical decisions. Patients started transferring to other practices, unwilling to trust a doctor who'd made such a catastrophic error in judgment. I eventually left that practice and moved to a different part of the country, taking a position at a walk-in center where I see patients only once and have no ongoing responsibility for their care. It's the only type of medical work I can still manage psychologically. The idea of developing long-term patient relationships, of being someone people trust with their health over time, is too frightening now. I can't risk making another referral that might harm someone. I still think about those 3 women constantly, particularly Margaret, who trusted me most completely and suffered most extensively as a result. I think about the appointments I sent them to, believing I was helping them access specialized care when I was actually facilitating their abuse. I think about the videos that still exist somewhere online, permanent records of violations that happened because I didn't ask enough questions or verify information I should have checked. The worst part is knowing it's still happening. Helen's group was one operation, but the police explained these schemes are increasingly common. Criminals pose as medical professionals, pharmaceutical representatives, research coordinators, anything that gives them access to vulnerable patients through the medical system. They exploit doctors' desire to help, patients' desperation for relief, and the trust that makes healthcare possible. I wanted to warn other GPs about what happened, to share my story, so they'd be more careful about verifying referrals and programs. But doing so means publicly acknowledging my failure, potentially exposing my former patients to unwanted attention, and admitting that I'm the doctor who sent vulnerable women into danger. Medical journals weren't interested in publishing something so damaging to the profession's reputation. Conferences didn't want speakers discussing how easily medical trust could be exploited. So instead, I carry this knowledge silently, working in a walk-in center where I treat minor ailments and never have to make complex clinical decisions. I see patients with coughs and rashes and twisted ankles, conditions I can manage without referrals or trust or ongoing relationships. It's not the career I trained for or imagined having, but it's the only way I can continue practicing medicine without the constant fear of harming someone again. Sometimes I search for news about similar schemes, checking if anyone else has fallen for the same trick. I found a few stories about fake medical programs and fraudulent pharmaceutical companies, though none quite like what I experienced. I wonder how many other doctors have made similar mistakes but never discovered the truth, never found out where their referrals actually led. I think about Margaret particularly often, about the trust in her eyes when I explained the program to her, how grateful she was for the opportunity to try something new after years of unsuccessful treatments. She believed I was helping her, and I believed it too. We were both wrong, but my error had consequences she'll live with forever. The recording still exists somewhere in hidden corners of the internet, viewed by people I'll never identify. Those women's pain and vulnerability, which they'd shared with me as their doctor in hopes of finding relief, was converted into something else entirely. Their trust was exploited, their bodies violated, their dignity destroyed, all because I accepted information from someone whose credentials I should have verified but didn't. That's what keeps me awake now. Not dramatic fear or immediate danger, but the quiet, persistent guilt of knowing I facilitated harm to people who trusted me. The knowledge that somewhere online, permanent records exist of violations I enabled. The understanding that no amount of career change or geographical distance can undo what happened or restore what those women lost. I made a mistake, a single mistake born of wanting to help, of being too busy to verify information properly, of trusting someone who presented herself professionally and seemed legitimate. One mistake that echoed outward in ways I couldn't predict, that harmed people I'd sworn to protect, that continues harming them still through videos I can't remove and consequences I can't reverse. That's the reality I live with now, not the horror of malicious intent, but the horror of good intentions weaponized by people who understood exactly how to exploit a doctor's desire to help their patients, and knowing that somewhere, in hidden corners of the internet I'll never access, my failure is still being commodified and viewed, still causing harm, still existing as permanent evidence of the worst mistake I'll ever make.